Okay, before we start talking about chapters 32 to 47, the questions I've asked you about them, anything not directly related to these questions or these chapters that anyone wants to bring up at this point? Okay, here we go. So, in this conversation with between Sancho and the Duchess in chapter 33, not right at the beginning of our reading, but shortly afterward. It seems like Sancho is unusually suggestible in a way that he's not with Quixote, and I can't think of a precedent, another conversation in which he's quite this suggestible. And the suggestions he takes are odd ones that he accepts, in that he seems to be convinced of the opposite at one point and quickly changes his mind. And some of the things that the Duchess is suggesting are just as ludicrous as suggestions that Quixote has made that Sancho seems to reject. So I suppose we could ask a few different kinds of questions about this. Namely, one, why does he accept any one of these suggestions? Why does the Duchess make them? We could also ask, in general, what's the Duchess doing with Sancho in this scene? And what's the nature of the relationship between them, such that he accepts these suggestions and she makes them? So what do you think? Either considered one at a time or in general, what's going on in this scene? Any thoughts? Steve?
It feels a little bit like a chaste seduction. Okay, I mean, he's flattered that she's talking to him as, if not an equal, as a peer of some sort. And so he's accepting from her things that he would almost certainly protest that did from anywhere else. Even to the extent, again, of, agreeing to things about both himself implicitly and Don Quixote that, he's rejected in other circumstances in the past. But this felt to me, like a little bit of a seduction into the game.
And just to be clear, you take the Duchess to be seducing Sancho and not the other way around. So
yeah.
Right? Okay.
Again, this is a chase. There's nothing, there's nothing going to come of this other than, I'll use intellectually loosely. She's playing a mind game with him.
I see. Interesting. Jesse, go ahead, and then Margaret.
Well, I feel similar to Steve, but not exactly. I'm not sure her motivations except to entertain herself. It's kind of a sport for her. But I think that for Sancho, she's like, I'm trying to think back, kind of the first person who's taking him seriously or pretending to take him seriously, because I don't think she really is, but I think he thinks that she is. And so he's, this is like a wonderful thing. I mean, here's this woman so far above him in station and her elegance and everything. And she's kind of talking to him like he's a normal, intelligent person. So I think that he's willing to go along with what she says because he's so flattered by her attention. So I think that's his motivation. I really, again, I don't understand her motivation except, she's just like this awful person who's using these other people for her own entertainment.
Okay.
I've had throughout this book with other characters, like you asked in a later question.
Yeah. Right. She's one in the series of characters who've played with Quixote's mind in one way or another, whether for their own benefit or for something else. But okay, so what I'm hearing is, who knows why the Duchess is doing this? Maybe for her own pleasure, and if not that, it's really unclear. But here's why Sancho so readily assents to these claims that he should, it seems to us, resist. She's taking Sancho seriously in a way that no character has up to this point in the novel, and her high status makes her especially seductive, to borrow Steve's thought. Okay, thanks, Justin. Marjorie, go ahead.
I had a little different twist on it. I think he was being seduced by her in a way, but I think Sancho is also proving himself to be a really practical guy. And he's sitting there, and this woman of high stature has taken a liking to him, or it seems, and her husband has promised him this island. And so he's kind of like, okay, whatever you want to tell me, go ahead, you know. So I just see him as a little more calculating, I guess, in this whole exchange. And I think she genuinely likes him, and she's letting him off the hook a little bit for telling, pulling this trick on Don Quixote. But that was my interpretation of it.
Can you say more about that last part?
Well, he feels bad because he tricked Don Quixote into thinking this peasant woman was his lady, his lady love. And I think maybe she sees he feels bad, and she says, oh no, don't feel bad. I know for a fact it's true. You didn't lie, you didn't pull anything over on Don Quixote. So she's kind of letting him off the hook, comforting him in an odd kind of way.
So, okay, on this reading, it's not that Sancho actually believes these suggestions to which he seems to assent. He's just being pragmatic. He thinks if he tells the Duchess, if he accepts what she suggests as true, that'll smooth his road to being the governor of an island, and anything else that might come his way by way of his relation with the Duke and Duchess. And even though Sancho took himself to have deceived Quixote into thinking that a peasant girl was Dulcinea, the Duchess provides him a story according to which he didn't, even if he intended to deceive Quixote, he did not deceive Quixote. That was in fact Dulcinea. And that relieves Sancho of the guilt or of having anything to have to apologize for to Quixote. So this is actually kind of convenient for him, even if he doesn't believe it, to adopt.
He's like, okay, great. We'll go with that. We'll go with that story.
Okay. Any other thoughts about this? I mean, I suppose the question about what's motivating the Duchess in this scene could just expand into a question about what's motivating the Duke and Duchess more generally. So if there's any way we can kind of see the larger question in the smaller question, that now is as good a time as any of the number of occasions we'll have for discussing this today. Can you see anything about what the Duchess is up to more generally in what she's doing with Sancho in this scene? Yeah, Steve?
It's a little bit hard not to be similarly seduced by the Duchess here, because she seems like a genuinely nice person or kindly person. But through this whole sequence, I find myself, they're just a nicer version of the people who've been playing with Don Quixote and to a lesser degree Sancho's head all the way through. Mm-hmm. And there's this whole extended sequence of things they dream up, and we'll talk about a bunch of them as the evening goes on. But to me, this feels very much about, this is like the most fun thing they've had to do. Look who showed up on our door. The people that we read the outrageous book about and they're here and they're just like it's in the book. What a great time we can have, and let's spin this one out.
Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, that's like Jesse's reading. This is for her own pleasure. Best show in town. It's just expanded a little bit. We've seen characters who have some fun at Quixote and Sancho's expense in a few other episodes prior to this. And this is just the same kind of spirit of messing with Quixote and Sancho. The Duchess and Duke are especially well positioned to engage in. They have the resources to do this in an elaborate way. Do you want to add something to that, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, that's the surfacing. I mean, what's really interesting, and again, is it plays out as the trajectory for both Quixote and Sancho over these multiple episodes, because she may be doing it for her own purposes, but they get something out of it in the end too. I mean, again, Quixote gets treated more like a knight, and he feels like a knight than he has at any point on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
And arguably, Sancho begins to buy into the story as the sequence of events go on. And so it's an interesting thing. It's being done what feels almost a little bit cruel up front, but in the end, and again, I don't know what the end is, but at the end of the sequence tonight, you know, it's clear that at one level, the duo are getting something out of it also.
Mm-hmm. Remus, was your hand up? Yeah.
Yes, I agree, and I would say something more than just a little bit cruel. I found this whole sequence very troubling. When I read about Don Quixote in the ox cart, I know Steve mentioned that was troubling to him. This entire sequence of the Duke and Duchess seemed to me that they are extremely cruel to Don Quixote and Sancho, and they're doing it for their own sadistic pleasure. They enjoy seeing these two people humiliated. And I can't see how else they're going to elaborate lengths to humiliate them.
So, okay, we're definitely.
I think it's more than just a little cruelty.
So it's not just that they're taking pleasure in this, it's that they're taking pleasure in the humiliation and maybe the physical pain in the case of, well, a few different aspects of the theater to come of Quixote and Sancho. I mean, so I guess my question about that, Remus, is why do you think Cervantes is including this then? Why include these two, as you read them, fun-loving sadists who meet Quixote and Sancho and have the means to trap them in, at least temporarily, in this elaborate theatrical game in which they seem to be getting what they want, but are really getting a kind of punishment that goes along with it, as well as humiliation. Do you have any thought about that?
The only thing I can think of is I'm thinking that the novel is taking a more serious turn in part 2. It's not just a group of funny adventures of two madcap heroes, and now it's starting to, you start to think, and maybe Cervantes wants us to think, how are these two people being treated, and is this right the way they are being treated?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, April, and then Karen, and then John. Go ahead.
I hear what you're saying, Remus. I agree. It's cruel how they're operating, but I saw it differently as their motivation, that they're almost starstruck by this person that's come into their lives. They want to be part of the history, or I saw it as they're excited. They've read about this person, and if they can get this story moving along in a more elaborate way, perhaps they'll be part of the story in part 2. So yes, they're cruel, although they're cruel to trick someone who believes them and trusts them. That is cruel, I agree. But they also are treating him in a way that's above and beyond courteous. So it's a very strange setup of cruelty in that they're not, I guess they're testing Don Quixote, especially his allegiance to Dulcinea. But some of the things they do is to treat him as he wishes to be treated. And maybe we all do that at some times as well. So I didn't see it quite as dark as you see it, although I see the framing in your lens of that. I'm kind of rolling along with this as more of the story, and they're trying to push it along in this, what I perceive as fiction, not history.
Okay, so I'm hearing three things that are novel in there. April, tell me if I'm getting this right. So it's not just that these characters, the Duke and Duchess, are engaging with Sancho and Quixote as they do for the sake of their own pleasure. That's part of it. And likewise, it's not just for the sake of humiliating these guys or physically punishing them and deriving pleasure from that. They also want a piece of, to be on the inside of this famous story and to move it along. They're sort of, I don't know, the way they're edging their way onto the stage, trying to be at the center of the action. And I mean, lo and behold, they're in part two, so they succeeded in that. We should temper our impression about how cruel they are by these in accordance with these two observations, namely, they treat Quixote and Sancho with a good deal of courtesy. And not only that, the way in which they make the story that Quixote and Sancho want to take themselves to be in real for them is dictated in some measure by Quixote and Sancho themselves. So they're almost flattering Quixote and Sancho's delusions, but thereby accommodating them, giving them something that it seems like Sancho and Quixote both really want in some sense. Is that right?
That's definitely part of it. There are definitely scenes like with the wooden horse that are meant to embarrass Don Quixote and Sancho, but also to see how far they can take beliefs, right? Like, does Don Quixote believe what he's doing? It's just interesting. It's not clear cut to me that it's all cruel, all mean, meant to humiliate, meant to hurt. There's something else going on there that's engaging all of us to be the audience to these things and to push this plot in a fantastical direction.
Okay, thank you. Karen, and then John, Jesse, and Al.
Sure. Well, I don't go all the way towards them being sadistic, but I would describe the Duchess maybe as kind of a mean girl. Like, she is manipulating a little bit. Like a mean girl, she's still making sure that Sancho is like seen and heard, which probably makes him feel good. And I think her motivations are partly a sense of some kind of power. You know, all the women up until now in this book have been very powerless, and they're totally ruled by men. And she, in these stories, obviously because of her class and status, she's a little more powerful, but she's kind of toying with Sancho as her own plaything. Like it feels a little bit like she has some power in this relationship to make people do what she wants them to do, to elaborate this approach that she's taking with Sancho. And it seems to me that may be why she's motivated to do it, because she's doing it separate from the Duke. It's not him giving direction, she's giving direction.
So it seems like there's a matter of degree. I'm trying to figure out as you said, she's not sadistic, she's a mean girl. I was thinking, what's the difference between those things? But maybe this is a matter of degrees. If I were plotting various, harmful psychological traits, they would be overlapping, but not exactly the same. Okay, so.
Well, somebody who's sadistic, Noah, is sadistic just for the love of being cruel to others. You know, a mean girl is somebody who is kind of manipulative because she wants something out of it.
Okay, and on your reading, Karin, it sounded like what she wanted was to dominate Sancho, to exercise some power over Sancho. And
Not over Sancho, not dominate Sancho. I think she wants to exercise some power over this situation to be able to direct resources, you know, as part of the hopes that she's pulling on them. She kind of like directing some of the comedic play that's happening.
it sounded like you had kind of an answer, or it's in the territory of an answer to my question about what Cervantes is doing with this character, with your thought, well, look, we've seen a string of women in the novel who are largely powerless, or at least there's something about essential elements in their lives that gets decided by men. And here we have a character who's not like that. She seems to be in control. I mean, the Duke perhaps is calls some shots, but she herself exercises a degree of power. So maybe Cervantes is exploring this possibility for a female character in the novel.
And she's ultimately influencing some of the outcome of what of how Sancho responds and what he decides to do.
In a way that women have not thus far.
Yeah, there haven't been any other women characters who got to do that.
Okay, thank you. John, go ahead, and then Jesse Allison.
Yeah, I want to comment on all the issues you've been talking about, starting with what's Cervantes up to. As I was reading the last couple hundred pages, I was thinking about that a lot, and particularly in terms of comparing it to part 1. And then when I got to chapter 44, which we're going to talk about in number 4, the beginning of that, I thought, okay, I think he's explaining to us what he's doing in part 2 versus part 1. And I think if I read that right, and if I understood what's going on generally anyway, well, one basic thing is, if he writes 500 more pages of the same thing, this is not the greatest novel or one of the greatest novels of all time. It's just more of the same thing. So he was very creative, and he came up with new and different ways of Don Quixote pursuing his fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. And so, as I think he's explaining at the beginning of chapter 44, he can't just keep doing it by having these little side essays that the main characters, Sancho and DQ, don't participate in. They just listen to them. And then maybe at the end, Don Quixote agrees, okay, I'll go off and take care of the bad guys or whatever. But otherwise, they're just sitting there for a whole chapter or two. And some of them, many of them in the first part, they did participate in, and they were much smaller versions of what we're reading now. We get to the second part, and we have this big, elaborate scheme by the Duke and Duchess to really pull the wool over the eyes of these two guys. But it's more the same, but just much more creative and much more elaborate, much more interesting, much funnier, not as much slapstick and screwball. I think a little bit more sophisticated screwball. Yes, it is. I think it comes off a little more sadistic at times, but so did the other people in the first part. It was just lower key, I think. And the bottom line is, the narrative can't progress unless the two of them get help from all these characters along the way to move the fantasy along. And these two characters, the Duke and Duchess, are definitely moving this fantasy along. At least Don Quixote really buys that he's on this horse flying through the sky for hours, and he's way up in the sky and all that. Apparently, he believes that. And so I think I sort of think, I mean, I'm sorry to be so long-winded about this, but I think that's kind of what's going on, bigger picture, and in this particular, these particular chapters. And
So
they're
the
all
thought is, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, and I think they're all connected. And I think the second part, a lot of what we're seeing is the author, plain and simple, trying to do a better, addressing the critics, because he's often on the side. He did it a lot right at the beginning of the second part, but on the side throughout these chapters, he refers to the criticism he's received about the first part, directly or indirectly. And so part of it is doing that. Part of it is him as a good author, just trying to do a more interesting job, because it is more the same. It's Don Quixote going off on his so-called third Sally, and he's trying to make it more interesting. He's had 10 years to work on it and think about it. And he's got this competitor that wrote another version. And so he's just trying to be more creative about it. And he's kind of showing us literally at the beginning of chapter 44, in case you didn't notice, this is what I'm doing. So
Okay,
that's
so
how
so
I-
the thought is, look, the critics there have this criticism that you take this. I mean, Cide Hamete Benengeli says this about his own history, but maybe this is Cervantes speaking in Hamete's voice on behalf of himself, saying, here's what the critics didn't like about part one. There are all these episodes in part one that would have been admired in their own had they been published separately as short stories, but because they had nothing to do with Quixote and Sancho, apparently, so people couldn't, they couldn't see the connections, even if they did have something to do with Quixote and Sancho Panza. I'm just going to tell you a lot of stories, all of which involve Sancho and Quixote. So with that constraint in mind, here's some variety on the kinds of stories these guys have been experiencing already in part one. But I'm going to go bigger. I think that was the way that you put it. It's similar themes, but the variation is to intensify what was already there. And you have said one thing that I just want to ask you about. You said, I'm not going to get the words exactly in the same, it's not going to be the same words that you used, but the thought was something like, something in this story has to bring Quixote and Sancho further along in the direction they were already headed, and this brings them further along, or that this is something like a realization of something that was potential with them all along. Can you just say more about that? You think they were headed for something like this the whole time?
No, I think what I meant by that is they can't pursue this fantasy by themselves. They could, but for one thing, it'd be a 200-page book instead of 1,000, and it wouldn't be the greatest novel, the great novel that it is. In order to make it a full novel with lots of stories, they needed other characters who serve as catalysts for him to pursue his fantasy. And all these characters that come along, or that he comes along to, serve as catalysts in different ways, whether they just tell him a story or they trick him. Once they see what he's doing, they trick him in a small way or in a big way. More recently, in a big way.
Okay.
So all these characters, including the Duke and Duchess, are catalysts for him pursuing his fantasy. I look at it that way rather than just nasty people using him. They're helping him. They are not nice and taking advantage of him more than other people. But at the end of the day, we as readers, it doesn't change. I think as readers, it doesn't change our view of Don Quixote. We still like him. We're still sympathetic and empathetic to him, even though the Duke and Duchess might have had, if they were real people, would have had a different view of him than we do. I mean, we don't know at the end I don't think we get to the end of their dealing with him, but I sort of feel that's one way to look at it. Yeah. Yeah, they weren't nice, but it doesn't affect how we feel about them. The author has made sure that at the end of the day, and presumably at the end of the novel, we're going to have a positive, notwithstanding all the dumb things he does, we're going to have a positive view of Don Quixote.
Thank you, John. Jesse, go ahead.
Well, I remain in Remus's side about the kind of the sadism and the humiliation. That it just really bothered me, as it's bothered me throughout the book. And I'm struggling to understand what Cervantes' point was and is in all of this. And I'd like to, I'm drawn to some of what April said about the benefits to Don Quixote and Sancho and being treated the way they envision themselves being treated, and that's a good thing. But so I'm thinking that the Duchess and the Duke read the first story of Don Quixote. And when he shows up on their doorstep, I forget who said this, Karen maybe, shows up on their doorstep, they think this is fabulous. You know, we're going to really have fun being part of this story. But what I think is that they've seen by the stories in the beginning, they've seen how other people have taken advantage of, have used Don Quixote and Sancho for their own entertainment. So they've seen this, they've been kind of schooled in this. And so they feel they have every right to do it then. So it looks to me like from their position of more power or more status, they may feel this, I can do whatever I want to people, you know, and treat them however I want. So I'm wondering if that's part of Cervantes' idea here is greater power, greater status often leads to greater menace and malice. Whereas Don Quixote, as the story is progressing, says some incredible things about how to be a human being and how to treat other people. And I mean, it's remarkable. And maybe that's why this book is so long, to give us an opportunity to hear these things that I don't know that he could have come out with right in the beginning few hundred pages, because you know, we didn't know this character, we didn't understand him, he just seemed like some weird, misguided person, and yet as you hear what he says and how he thinks about things of great importance, it's very beautiful. So you contrast that with these people with the power and the political place, and you know, I'm thinking that's what Cervantes is doing, is showing us that great power is corruptive.
Okay, so it seemed to me two new thoughts in there. One was, I'm looking at 2F, which we're already kind of talking about. And you're saying the Duke and Duchess have read about, for instance, the innkeeper and the 2 prostitutes knighting Don Quixote. Those are not powerful people, but they're people who deceive Quixote. Why? I mean, whether it's for the same motivations, who knows? But they've read about Sancho lying to Quixote about Dulcinea. They've read about the deception of Quixote into thinking he's on a mission to serve the princess Micomicona, and then into thinking that he's being caged by an enchanter. And so they are going where they see others have gone before. There's a kind of like herd mentality that they're falling into, perhaps. Other people have given them license to do the same thing, or a variety of the same thing to Quixote and Sancho that these other characters in part 1 have done. That's an interesting thought. And then there's this, you know, Cervantes is skewering the wealthy and powerful. which I mean, that could be, although a number of these other characters don't have much status at all, and they similarly seem to play with Quixote. So I don't know if there's something special about the Duke and Duchess. Maybe they just, on your reading, Jesse, have greater means to do this, and maybe means of restraining themselves from doing it, so it's especially bad when they do it, or something like that.
Yeah. But also that people with power have a responsibility to behave charitably. Now, I know they don't. I mean, I know that's kind of Pollyanna, but maybe that's part of what Cervantes is saying, that look what happens when they don't. The person who understands how to act towards other human beings is Don Quixote.
Thank you. Alec, go ahead, and then Cindy, and then Steve.
Yes, a couple of things, a couple of angles I'd like to approach this from, and some of them overlaps with what others already said. I think from the overall motivation point of view of the Duke and Duchess, I'm very much aligned with the sentiment Rimas pointed out. I think on the fundamental level, it's more of a sadistic manipulation rather than let's have some fun and it doesn't hurt anybody. The way I see this compared to, if they just want to be part of a great fun history, is I think they're treating Don Quixote and Sancho more like circus animals or lab animals rather than somebody that's on equal footing. They're just pursuing interesting but different adventures. It's like these people think this animal, if you give them something, they can do a dance. Let's give them more things and see how much they can dance. Or that's the overall feeling I get. And in terms of people with more power and more means can do more, I definitely agree. And that might be why it's there from a literary and content point of view, like John pointed out, with these people being more resourceful and have more willingness to create this, create help to further along this fantasy. They're essentially building a fancier circus for the animals to perform in. They're not saying your pursuit is worthy or at least interesting. Let me, for example, fund your pursuit and let's see what interesting thing happens. But they create like a frame or a sandbox and watch how they play in it rather than they play together. So that's my understanding in terms of their motivation, and there might be from a content point of view a elevated degree to this fantasy that comes out of it. More specific to these beginning chapters and how the Duchess framed these questions regarding, if your master, if Don Quixote was wicked or stupid to do that must mean his squire is more so, etc. I think at the beginning stage of their interaction, it could very well serve as a testing the water, testing the degree of gullibility and a degree of loyalty between the people. So they have an idea, just how crazy or mad these people are. But the way they framed the questions ties into how they framed other questions later, like whether or not Sancho should do self-punishment on himself, or if you don't do this, you lose the governorship. There's a thing where these questions is framed as if Sancho agreed that it was enchantment, he gets an easy way out. He can justify what he did, which is to deceive his master. is he going to stand up to himself by saying, no, I really just deceived people and this was no enchantment? That doesn't sound like a great reason to focus. But I think there's the beginning stage of testing and seeing how much they can manipulate this team, this partnership, and ties into the future episode as well.
Okay, I'm hearing three main things in there. I have a question about one of them and then a big provocative question for you, Alec. I like the comparison of the Duke and Duchess to spectators at a circus, or people who maybe set up the circus and then want to be in the audience watching it. Insofar as Quixote and Sancho are clown-like figures, that seems apt. So that's one thought, that you think that this is a sadistic pleasure that the Duke and Duchess are taking in setting up these elaborate fantasies for Sancho and Quixote to engage in, that will involve undergoing some painful experiences, maybe humiliation, and that's similar to the pleasure that one might take at a circus watching clowns. I take it especially. One way you characterize this, which I thought was interesting, and I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about this, is to say that if they were taking Sancho and Quixote seriously, they'd provide them with the means to pursue ends that Sancho and Quixote were already pursuing. Namely, like they'd help Quixote disenchant Dulcinea, presumably, or and help Sancho, I don't know, pursue his governorship. And in a way, they set up a fantasy version of both of those things, but they don't actually help the two obtain those ends. But I mean, would it be compassionate to try to help these guys by giving them genuine means to the ends they take themselves to be pursuing, namely the service to Dulcinea or acquisition of a governorship? I don't even know what that would look like if the Duke and Duchess set out to provide these guys with, took the ends of Quixote and Sancho more seriously than they do, rather than giving them sham ends or sham means to those ends. So to watch the fun play out, if they gave them genuine means to those ends, what would that even be? And am I understanding the distinction?
Yeah, I believe so. I think by doing what they did now, I think it created a lot of very interesting and valuable stories. And for example, Sancho probably would have never become an actual governor, but seeing how he governs in later chapters is quite extraordinary. But everything is within the Duke and Duchess's control. And it's not communicated between them and Don Quixote and Sancho, saying this is what we created for you to fantasy play. But it's within their control under the assumption that they are operating within their manipulation. It's not, they get a sense of satisfaction, but without actually doing it. So I guess what I mean is, if they thought these are interesting people pursuing interesting, although different goals, I don't know how exactly it would help, for example, help Don Quixote to pursue Dulcinea or disenchant her, but like their travels or I don't know, provide more means for them to explore the world or reach different parts of the land. Or I frankly haven't thought like how they would do that, but they are not doing it as peers, but rather as master and playthings, in my opinion.
So the reason I find that so interesting, one reason, I'll spell this out, and then I have one final provocative question for you, is that it's under normal circumstances with people who are in their right minds and not so ignorant of what's good for them that they're like Sancho, going off on an adventure that might cause them a good deal of harm. It seems like a fair description of a kind of humane treatment of someone, even a philanthropic treatment, to say, I'm going to help you by giving you the means to the ends that you are already pursuing. But of course, the priest and the barber take themselves to be doing what's good for Quixote, if not also for Sancho, in part one, when they try to trick them into coming back home. And they do it by trying to steer Quixote, at least, away from the ends that he's pursuing. Is their treatment humane? I mean, in one respect, it seems yes, that perhaps the deception we might think of as cruel, but the priest and the barber take it to be a necessary means to the end that they think Quixote ought to have, namely to go home and restore himself to sanity. So, you know, with a person whom one takes to be insane, the idea that supplying the means to the ends that they've already adopted is the right way to be humane with them. I mean, that's tricky.
Yes, I think definitely this is a very debatable question. You know, is eradicating your idea of madness, eradicating your ideas of chivalry better for you, or just to create a fantasy world for you to have a sense of satisfaction in better? And I think that would actually have a real world relevance in our life, like with the development of virtual reality, the metaverse, etc. I think it's very foreseeable that if you just want to live in a virtual world, you know, without a job, you can get a $200 device and be in a virtual world that is fantastical all the time pretty soon. And being in Silicon Valley, I see a lot of development in that. But in that world is finding a way for people to do that better, or, you know, still go through your professional training, know how to conduct yourself in the real world better. But that's maybe a separate story. But I don't have a clear answer to that debate.
I think it's an apt analogy, though. I mean, it's an interesting thought. That's a rabbit hole. There's a lot there. But let me ask you this, my final provocative question, right? So in treating Quixote and Sancho as these clown figures for whom they want to set up an elaborate circus so they can watch the drama or the comedy play out, aren't the Duke and the Duchess on that description a lot like us, or a lot like Cervantes? You know, we've got these characters who are really funny under certain circumstances. We kind of like watching their antics. We take a pleasure out of being spectators. What's the difference between the Duke and the Duchess and us? Or is there something interesting about our occupying a similar position, or perhaps Cervantes occupying a similar position? What do you think? Any thoughts about that?
You mean from us who read their story and
or demand a part two, or I mean, demand more stories like this because we think they're funny and good entertainment, and we're willing to last all 1,000 pages through a novel about them because it's
right. I think it's a difference between the people who are in a reality show versus the people who watch it. In reality shows, there must be drama and turbulence for it to be interesting. But if you are like the house flipping shows, the house flip must be going through some troubles for it to be on HGTV. But when you're doing a house flip or a remodel, you would probably not hope to discover a big foundation problem right after you close on the property, right? So I think there's a way of how you would act in that scenario, and if you would, for example, mentally manipulate the person saying, "Do you are you loyal to your master? Then lash yourself 3,000 times." Yeah, I might find that interesting in the literature. I might not do that as a person.
Thank you. So I mean, on that reading, it seems like the most salient difference is the Duke and Duchess belong to the same world as Quixote and Sancho, and we don't. We're readers of a story. That's a really important ethical difference. Interestingly, that's really the mistake, the characteristic mistake at the heart of Quixote's madness is exactly one that collapses that distinction. He takes himself to be a figure in the stories that he's read. I think, yeah, anyway, you're playing with exactly the dynamics that are kind of at the basis of the what Cervantes is playing with Quixote. Okay, Cindy, go ahead, and then Steve, and then Marjorie.
So I have a different view of them. I think the Duchess particularly, but also the Duke, they're super fans. They're excited. They've read an income. I mean, if the doorbell rings tonight and I walk out and Don Quixote and Sancho Panza are there, I want to play the game with them, right? And other than I haven't figured out how this lashing thing is going to work, though I can't imagine he's actually going to have to lash himself. They're giving them what they want. They're giving them the ability to act out what they believe. It's, I suppose, similar to when you buy children costumes to play Batman or Princess or whatever they play. It's also sometimes the way we treat people who are in dementia. You know, there's a story about Sandra Day O'Connor's husband falling in love with someone else in the home he was in, and how she dealt with that and came over and sat down with the two of them. So I'm not saying they aren't enjoying it, because they really are. They're like these Comic Cons or when everybody goes and plays, and it is very elaborate. But I'm not seeing the harm that I would see if the vicar had his way. He confronts these people, and then don't you think Don Quixote and probably Sancho Panza end up in some insane asylum somewhere? Or they're out in the first book, every time they played their game, Don Quixote lost more teeth. This is actually a safe way for him to be all the things he thinks he can be. There may be, it would be interesting if they could figure out a way to give Sancho an island and give Don Quixote Dulcinea, but I doubt that's actually realistic. So within the possibilities of what you could do with these people, if they showed up on your doorstep and you had the means and you wanted to be part of the play, they're part of the play. I guess I don't see them, I don't see the, you know, kind of like the sadism. I don't see it as a level of sadism that maybe other people are seeing it. And I think I don't know what happens when Sancho and Don Quixote, if they ever do look back on their lives, but this is part of the adventure they were looking for in a relatively safe environment, because part one was not very safe. I don't think they would have lived through an entire part two. But anyway, that was, I think, more the way I saw this than as them like really being kind of mean people. And I don't know what the alternative is if my doorbell rings. So you can let me know what I can do when my doorbell rings. But I'm pretty much thinking I'd have loved to set some of this up for them and watch them enjoy themselves. And, you know, I mean, all those stories with Sancho making those great decisions, was he not having a good time being governor? And weren't those good anyway, you know, I can see a way of looking at it the other way, but that's not the way I looked at it. I looked at it more as really what people do in theater, and they're playing theater with them, and these guys are the ultimate method actors. They're so into it, they are the characters. So and I think it layers on for what Cervantes is doing. It layers on. It also allows them, like I said, I think there's a safety issue. I don't know how much more beaten up really these two people could have taken. So I felt it was a much more fonder or excited, and maybe they get too excited by getting part of it. But every time she says to the servants, treat him like the knight he is, I see that as kind. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but that's the view I had of them.
So Alex said it would be humane, philanthropic to supply these guys with the means to the ends they've already got when they meet the Duke and Duchess. And Cindy, it sounds like you're saying the Duke and Duchess do exactly that. They give them a way to live out the stories that they that Quixote and Sancho would most like to live out. Not only that, it's even better. It's the safest possible way to do it. You know, without all the lost teeth and the bruises and the exposure to real danger, the holy brotherhood and so forth.
Because people in their position actually should be calling the guy with the white coats and the doctor. And I
Right.
can't imagine having to do that if they knock on my door. That would be the saddest part of the night for
And it-
me, to pick up the phone, to have them committed somewhere because they're crazy.
It sounds like you're answering the question that I put to Alec. Aren't the Duke and the Duchess in some respect like us in wanting to see the clowns perform in their clown show, with that comparison of them to fans at Comic-Con? I take it that is one way of understanding what fans at Comic-Con want. I mean, it's probably complicated what they want, but one thing they want is to see more of the show, to get closer to it, to be in on the inside of it somehow.
Be in the
Uh,
show, yeah. Yeah.
So they are like us. They're devoted readers who want to be really close to the characters that they've enjoyed thus far.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Steve, go ahead, and then Marjorie.
Yeah. As folks were talking on their different perspectives, I started thinking along a slightly different line. I thought of thinking about the story of Parsifal and the Holy Grail, and whether these aren't the trial, whether you couldn't think of these from, this may be at the Cervantes level, that all these different adventures, which Don Quixote is, riding out and finding himself in the middle of, and Sancho with him, aren't trials and tests of his commitment or his faith in some way, in terms of the ideal, the chivalric ideal. These are all a series of tests, and many of the tests in the first book and on the second book involve physical beating and the ability to maintain faith and continue the journey and the quest. And this isn't, at one level, the Duke and Duchess, will put the lashing aside, but I think again, it's this whole notion that each of these are a series of tests for them to go through. And, Don Quixote, it's in terms of the chivalric ideal. In terms of Sancho, maybe it's a more secular thing of wanting to be a governor and be rich. But it's also a test of his faith in Don Quixote. And so look at it in that light, the Duchess, in kind of saying these things, is testing him. And maybe in this case, he doesn't really quite reach the level, or hasn't quite got to the point where he's ready to commit to Don Quixote and really believe in the dream that they're both pursuing together. But I think that in one sense, these are fantastical adventures, and they're funny, and they're slapstick, and they're a little manipulative, and they talk about power structures. But at the end of the day, for the two main characters, these are, stepping stones for them to either slip and fall off of, or to be able to continue to say, can they maintain their pursuit and their faith in the dream, despite them?
So that's interesting. I want to ask you about whether there's a moral difference at this point, because it seems like that's one thing that's exercised people in this conversation, Steve, right? So you might think in part one, Quixote and Sancho undergo tests of various kinds. Some of them are tests that they pass in a manner that reveals, I don't know how to say this, they're almost like more genuine tests of their commitment to one another, which has a practical effect on their story together. Some of them are tests that Quixote, for instance, takes himself to be passing, but he's not, when he seems to overcome a giant, or to do something courageous in a situation where courage is not called for. He passes the test, but there's the practical effect of that is hard to read, because he's not in a circumstance that actually has the qualities of a test. Here, there are two characters who are concocting the nature of the tests that these guys are facing. They're not tests that Quixote or Sancho are projecting onto the situation, or that emerge organically out of a situation that they find themselves in, as when Quixote or Sancho is genuinely attacked and they have to demonstrate loyalty to one another by defending the other one, for instance. Does it make a difference that the tests that Quixote and Sancho are up against with the Duke and Duchess are deliberately concocted by people who know better, who know that these don't have, they're not live tests, not actual tests?
I think that that's a progression. I think that as opposed to these being kind of just one story after another, I think that's a progression, an author very deliberately putting the progression in terms of, and then again, as you said, early in the journey, the tests are as much about Sancho's willingness to go along, and at a couple of times he comes close to just bagging out and saying, "I'm done." And certainly, Don Quixote's willingness to continue on, and allow himself. I mean, the faith is more about continuing the journey in the first book, and in the end, we have our first conclusion is the journey at one level gets cut short, because as we find out in the second book, Don Quixote only gets to really feel like a knight when he gets to the Duke and Duchesses and gets treated like a knight. And so kind of looking back retrospectively, you can say, okay, he never really got to the point where his belief in his journey kind of merged with his self. And again, there's the level of the madness and the insanity and stuff like that. There's kind of another layer on it. But to me, it's about pursuing, his vision of chivalric, purity, despite, again, initially tests he had to find for himself, and as he progressed, tests people give to him.
That's interesting. There's a lot in there. I mean, I'm going to try out an analogy and see if this works to try to cut to the heart of the question I asked you. So imagine there are two little boys who play make-believe, whether they realize that the make-believe is a fantasy or not. And they're always doing things that are like slightly reckless, or they tell themselves are really dangerous and call for bravery, and they genuinely get hurt as they do it. And so in some sense, they're putting themselves up to tests, whether they intentionally or not. At a certain point, a grown-up shows up and tells them what they took to be, they have been saying they've been fighting giants and rescuing maidens and so forth, and they're right? And the grown-up doesn't really believe that, but confirms
the question of what it's in. The question I'd ask is, in that case, those are physical tests about, characteristics of virtue. The test that Don Quixote has set out for himself is much more spiritual or metaphysical, in terms of being able to maintain fidelity to an ideal despite. And so, I mean, there's some level of similarity there, but I think the ultimate test for Don Quixote is almost, can he maintain his madness, or can he transmute his madness into, a real, because again, he's trying to be a model for others to follow. Maybe Sancho is the only guy who ends up following him. But I think it's a different kind of test than a purely, the physical tests are a part of it, but the real test is about, can he maintain his fidelity to the goal?
Right. So does it make any difference that somebody is concocting the test? Even if it has a kind of real spiritual importance for Quixote, it's not about whether he suffers the right amount along the way. It's about whether he commits to this conception of himself as virtuous and his fidelity to Dulcinea and so forth. Does it matter whether the tests that he takes himself to be facing and to pass that require undergoing some trial to prove his spiritual worthiness? Does it matter that the tests are figments of his own imagination or concocted by, as opposed to concocted by people who know better. I mean, it sounds like with your pointing to
I
the
think
line.
I mean, the answer is in terms of it, does it matter? I mean, I think it's a progression. In terms of being able to set out, I mean, think about, there are things that there are tests I can set out for myself. Okay, but I have control over what those tests are. And I can even retroactively decide that chasing after windmills was successful because I decided that they were giants. So arguably, tests that someone else puts in front of me that show, can I, again, bring myself to buy into those tests as wholeheartedly as the ones that I bought for myself? I mean, to me, as I read it, that's another level of testing.
Thank you. Marjorie, go ahead.
Well, as I was reading this, and I think Steve was saying this, I kept going back to religion and the Inquisition. I don't know very much about it, but my understanding is Jews and Muslims were being forced to give up their religion. And then I forget the name, what they were called at that time, but then they could be asked at any time or posed with some test, like I guess it was common they'd be served pork and see if they would eat pork to test their whether they had really converted to Christianity or not. So that's what I kept kind of coming into my mind as I'm reading this. Is he making a comment on the Spanish Inquisition? Is there a bigger comment here that Cervantes is making? The other thing I was thinking as I was reading this, I was thinking, what keeps Don Quixote and especially Sancho going? Why, after 500 pages, especially Sancho, who knows Don Quixote is crazy and he knows he's never going to end up with anything, he's kind of come to that realization. Why doesn't he go home like he says he's going to several times? And then here come the Duke and Duchess, sort of the supreme enablers that give him some hope and some reason for continuing. So I thought it was kind of a way for Cervantes to continue the story and to kind of make you see how these two characters would continue in their fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
So those were two of the thoughts I had.
Now they've got solid evidence that continuing along the path they've been going is seems like a reasonable idea.
Right.
Let me ask you, Marjorie, so this idea about either the Duke and Duchess as figures that are meant to represent the inquisitors, or Quixote as a converso, as somebody who's converting to a new religion and therefore sort of has the burden of demonstrating his faith. Can I just ask, so what, it seems like committing to a way of life, a set of beliefs for which there's not clear, universally available empirical evidence, but that you adopt nevertheless as articles of faith. It seems to me that's the project of any faithful person, whether they're converting or not. So what is it about either Quixote's story and maybe Sancho's, or the figure of the Duke and the Duchess that suggests, bring to mind this theme of tests for converts rather than tests for, any religious person? Can you just say more about this? I want to hear.
Well, I wish I knew more about it. Just because that's what was going on, I think, at this time period, during this time, I think that it must be relating back to that. So they're asked to complete these tasks and these tests at the whim of somebody else. And does it really mean anything? Is it testing their faith, as Steve was suggesting? Are they being tested over and over to see how strong they believe?
Yeah.
I don't know. Somebody else probably knows. I'm sure knows more about it than I do.
No, I think there's an answer to my question in there. So the idea is, it's not very common with at least faiths with which we might be the most familiar for the believer to undergo a series of trials, constant trials. That is one way a lot of deeply committed religious people conceive of what it means to be committed, but it's not a very common experience for, say, well, adherence, sort of ordinary adherence to major world religions, as far as I can think. But it is common if you're trying to detect false from true converts to subject them to tests, and especially in this historical context for the inquisitors to do this with former or maybe still present secret Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity. So that makes sense to me. Thank you. Rimas, go ahead, and then Steve.
Oh, just a small comment about the difference between part 2 and part 1. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's just what mood the reader is in. But it seemed to me in part 1 that there was a certain lightness and a frivolity to it. When we got to the Duke and Duchess and all these schemes that they've concocted and that Don Quixote and Sancho are falling for, after the scheme is finished, there's always a sentence that the Duke and the Duchess were laughing to themselves. They were enjoying it. And I can tell you that I wasn't laughing. And I don't know if anyone else was laughing. I mean, you look at the scene, it seems like it's a slapstick comical scene, you know, the firecrackers going off on the wooden horse or something. But at least for me at this point, it wasn't funny anymore. Whereas maybe Don Quixote attacking the windmills or attacking a flock of sheep as an army was somewhat amusing in part 1. The amusement, something has happened to make it different now.
And what is that something, Rimas? Is it just, because, Cindy, I take it earlier, was pointing out, when Quixote attacked the windmill and the sheep, he got really hurt. He doesn't get really hurt in any of the fantasy scenes that the Duke and the Duchess concoct. But I take it, what is different that makes these scenes not funny? Is it that these two figures are deliberately manipulating Quixote and Sancho for their own amusement, or is it more than that?
I just feel that they're being humiliated, and that's a different type of hurt, to be publicly humiliated.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Steve, go ahead, and then Charles.
A couple of thoughts. One, in response to Marjorie's comment, I think it's possible that they're talking about the conversos, but actually I think this is one where the Catholic Church at this point was more afraid about a potential Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther basically dies in 1546, but Cervantes is actually born the next year. And the concern at that point had shifted from maintaining the purity of Spain. So I think that the faith tests are much more the faiths of the professed believers rather than the faiths of the converts. Just a thought there. Relative to Remus's question on the sadistic, and I've kind of gone back and forth. This is one where and I don't know whether we get to one more of these tonight. This is one where Cervantes kind of shows his artistic creed at several points during the book. in terms of wanting to delight and amaze and entertain. And I don't think he's kidding there. I think that whatever he's doing, that is a serious undertone to it for sure. But I think that with the fantastical elements of these stories, he's doing what he says he wants to do, what a good book does. It entertains, it delights, it amazes, it comes up with fantastical occurrences. And that's part of what he regards as his role. And that's my job as an author, that whatever else I'm doing, I'm going to entertain you. And so I don't, in that context, I probably come in more in the mean girl camp that Karin brought up, rather than the more sadistic kind of view where they're really being harsh.
And that reading does seem to draw the Duke and Duchess's sensibilities into line with the sensibilities of the reader as as Cervantes perceives them. Namely, they want what we want. We want a good show. A good book delights and gives us a good show. Just that's what the Duke and Duchess are seeking for themselves. Okay, Charles and then Karin, go ahead.
I'm in Remus's camp on several levels, but are things that he said, and his most recent comment. I think the difference between part one and part two, or one difference is, in part one, these were things that Don Quixote and Sancho were doing. In part two, with the Duke and Duchess, these were things that were done to them. And that points up what I'll call the cruelty or the sadism of the second part. The other thing is, and this is just my reaction to the whole Duke and Duchess thing, I lost interest. I mean, when is this going to end? It looked so ridiculous that they were coming up with all these stupid little plots, games to beat up on Sancho and Don Quixote. It just, I know it's in the novel and we can't cut it out, but it just didn't do much for me at all.
So this is Cervantes actually failing by the standards that Steve says he sets out, namely to delight us with a series of charming stories.
I was not delighted.
Yeah.
I must confess.
Well, fair enough. Karin, go ahead.
Well, I'm struggling a little bit with the whole discussion about it being cruel and sadistic for a particular reason, because I feel like we're applying a 21st century point of view to what we're reading. Because at the time that, you asked what motivates Cervantes, at the time that he wrote this, he's portraying a society the way it was. It was a very class-based society. People like, the nobility had all the power. People were not, ever, there was no justice. People weren't reprimanded for treating their, servants and serfs cruelly. When the nobility met, they had no phones or tablets or internet or whatever, and their entertainment was jesters and masks and various kinds of court plays and theatrical presentations. And it seems like there's a lot of elements of this throughout Don Quixote. So when you say, like, what was Cervantes' motivation, I assume he wanted his book to be read. I mean, Steve said to entertain and delight, and I think entertainment is part of it, but if he wanted it to be read, the only people who could actually read it were the nobility that he's portraying here. And so I wonder if we are being a little harsh in our judgment. It's like I think what we're trying to uncover in terms of his intent is an interesting discussion, but I think to some degree he's also portraying society as it was at the time that he was writing. And, I think we're interpreting it through a really different lens.
Okay, so the thought is norms about class and status and maybe the corrupting influence of a power that one derives from one's birth and good fortune make it so that Cervantes is just portraying the world as it is. The rich and powerful would exploit the unfortunate for their own amusement. That's
All the
just how-
time.
Okay, so let me ask you the question, Karen. How are we different? I mean, that might be provocative. When I was asking that question to Alec, I take it, the question was, well, this is kind of what readers and audience members do with spectacles of many different kinds. I don't think it's the case that as readers and audience members of stories, fictional or not, of all kinds, we're actively manipulating events, but we do want to see clowns be clowns and do the thing that we like to see them do. But I guess when I ask you that question, I'm asking a more morally loaded version of the question. So if we take the Duke and the Duchess to be metaphorical figures that stand in for authors and readers, I take it, then the question I asked Alec is the pertinent one. In demanding stories of this kind, are we Duke and Duchess like, wanting clowns to be clowns and wanting just the perfect situations for them to suffer humiliation and think that they're doing well, but undergo kind of harmless, painful episodes and so forth. If the Duke and Duchess stand for the cruel and callous nobility who treat people who are socially and primarily socially beneath them as their playthings, how are we different? I guess is a more right. Like what has changed? Is it just that we tend to be more humane in thinking that?
I think we have developed concepts of morality and social justice. I mean, we have a liberal tradition has brought around democracies which believe that all people are created equal and we should treat each other as human beings. And I mean, at that time in that society, that was not a belief that prevailed. So I think
the way to push this is to say, don't we have our versions of taking pleasure in the humiliation and pain of people who are kind of figures of fun for us, even if we don't define them by virtue of our relation to them, by virtue of our being higher class and their lower class?
Sure. I think,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, I think and entertainment means that we're looking, we all are entertained by different elements, and we can be entertained by someone being taken advantage of. But I just think that this notion that we have about it being especially sadistic and cruel is more through the lens of social justice and what we believe about, equal humanity these days versus in Cervantes' time. I'm not convinced that he as an author would have been necessarily concerned about that. He might have wanted to make a statement about how society should change, in terms of people not being taken advantage of. But I just don't think it's the same comparison.
Okay, so by this reading, I take it, if Cervantes is genuinely skewering an attitude that he thinks prevails among the rich and powerful and highborn in his day, you think he would look at our age and say, thank God that's over, basically, like things are a lot better.
No, he wouldn't.
Okay.
He wouldn't look at it. He wouldn't look at it and say it's over, because it's still happening, because human nature is human nature. But if that was his intent to skewer the highborn and noble people, then who in the hell did he think he was going to sell his book to? That's what I'd like to know. Because those were the only people who could read it.
Yeah, I don't know much about literacy in early 17th
Maybe he
century.
thought they would be, too foolish to understand it. I don't know.
Yeah, interesting thought. Thank you. Alec, go ahead, and then Jesse.
I just want to quickly answer that question again, if we're the same. I think even though I very much agree with Karen that we have a possibly better understanding of moral standard and such, we definitely still get pleasure from seeing, at least many people do, seeing conflicts, seeing, I mentioned reality shows. A lot of them are about, people fighting over mindless things, about people flaunting their wealth, about people doing this and that would be not considered proper, but they are doing it. However, we're in the same world, but not everybody is able to be in that role. That's why not everybody is a reality star, even though there's like probably hundreds of millions of reality TV watchers. So I think we're in the same world where we still have to a large degree similar source of entertainment, but yeah, not just everybody is capable or willing to do everything.
I mean, that reality TV is probably an excellent comparison for what the Duke and the Duchess are up to. If we're trying to think about like what's the difference in the mentality, or is there any sort of remnant of the mentality that Cervantes might be condemning in the figures of the Duke and Duchess at work in our own society on a grand scale, right? So I'm trying to, I don't watch enough reality television or know enough about it to really like muster great examples, but bear with me, I'm going to do my best. So like there's shows in which contestants are sent off into like horrible, punishing physical conditions, or made to do things that are humiliating or gross.
Eat bugs and jump off cliffs and all that.
And likewise, it's a common trope on the more emotional reality shows to have crazy characters who we all know are crazy, or villains who, they know their role going onto the show is to be the person we all love to hate. And right, we viewers, we don't set that up, but the producers do it on our behalf. We know the genre, we know what we're getting in for, and this is a kind of live form of entertainment. I take it, our notions about the dignity of the individual and human rights and don't restrain us, at least many of us, from engaging in this. There could be something very different about the Duke and the Duchess relative to the reality show producer or audience that is morally salient in distinguishing between them. But that does seem to me an apt and kind of complicated analog for what's going on here. Thanks for bringing it up again, Alec. I think there's really something to that. Jesse, go ahead. Oh, okay. Any other thoughts about just, so what I want to do is look at the particular details of the theatrical tricks, the pranks that the Duke and the Duchess play on Quixote. And we've talked about them at a level of generality that I think is warranted. We should be thinking like, why are the Duke and the Duchess doing this? How should we think about the kind of moral assessment of what they're doing? Are Quixote and Sancho getting what they really want out of this, even though the Duke and the Duchess are not setting up conditions so they'll ever get the things they take themselves to want, namely a real island to govern and the disenchantment of Dulcinea and so forth. So I think this is really worthwhile, but I would love to look at the individual details. Maybe we should, it's 7:29 my time. Rather than raising another question, why don't we take 15 minutes now and come back at 7:44 my time, and we'll dive into the details. Okay, so see y'all in 15 minutes. Press the record button and get us going again. So as promised, I think in a way we're going to be on the same topic. Yes, Steve?
I just need to share an analogy which, for people of a certain age, it may resonate more than others. But as we were talking about the Duke and the Duchess and reality TV, I couldn't help but get this image of like Simon Cowell is the Duke and Paula Abdul is the Duchess, you know, and the early rounds of American Idol way back when, where you've got people who, some who are genuinely talented, but the really funny ones where they're thinking that they were going to be the great next American pop star, but make utter idiots of themselves and trying to maintain a straight face for as long as you could, hopefully till they were off stage. And then you could then say all the nasty things you wanted to about them. I mean, the only difference is now we feel a little guilty about doing that. And maybe 400 years ago, they didn't feel too guilty about doing that. But it is so, you know, the human nature doesn't change too much. And I think you're really right to point that I mean, the reality TV show thing is just so online. We're watching, you know, Don Quixote live.
Yeah, there's really something to that. I think you could go through I was just telling my girlfriend during the break that I wish I knew reality TV better, because I think you could really draw this out. There are various genres of reality TV. A lot of them have a competition element. The genre that you're talking about, Steve, where people are really earnestly trying to be discovered, that does seem apt. Likewise, you know, when people are being emotionally manipulated, or when they are supposed to fall in love or be selected to as the love interest of some central character, or stepping into roles that we expect them to step into, and they've watched prior seasons and they know what roles there are to play and so forth. I mean, it really is a very rich analog for what's going on with the Duke and Duchess. I thought you were going to say something like about Candid Camera when you were saying maybe only people of a certain generation would pick up on this, but well, early reality TV, I suppose that.
About Laurel and Hardy.
Yeah, there's probably something to that. Even that, like actual clowns, people who made their living acting as clowns. Yeah, I've been watching Buster Keaton the last week. It seems like he's somewhere a descendant of Quixote in some sense. Okay, so as promised, we've talked about in general terms how we should understand the figures of the Duke and Duchess, how we should understand their motivations, how we should assess them morally, how we should think about what Cervantes is doing with these characters, what his interest is in this particular twist in the narration. I think those are all still on the table, but I'd like to work through some of the details of the fantasies that they concoct for Sancho and Quixote that might liven up our thoughts about the more general questions and might be interesting in their own right. So 2A, why do you think the Duke and the Duchess, and you might draw on your prior remarks in thinking about this, why do you think the Duke and the Duchess have Sancho challenged to lash himself? Why tie his lashing himself to the disenchantment of Dulcinea? In other words, like turn Sancho into the ultimate Quixote, at least in one sense. He's the only one who can bring about Dulcinea's disenchantment, and he can only do it by undergoing physical punishment. In fact, not just undergoing it, but inflicting it on himself. They say Quixote can't do it. It's got to be Sancho. Why have the Duke tie Sancho's governorship to Sancho's lashing himself? I take it all these things seem like deliberate choices on Cervantes' part, and I want to know why. So any thoughts about this are most welcome. John, go ahead, and then Alec. John, you're muted.
Missed the best part of what I wanted to say.
Oh no.
No, I think I mean, you could go right to, of course, the sadistic theme. It might be the best example of it. But I think, and one way to look at it is how far is he willing to go to get his little island governorship? How far is he willing to go? I think it's just a humorous ultimate irony by Cervantes to have him challenged with this when throughout the entire book, you have Don Quixote, despite all his craziness and all that, he is always willing to charge into any danger, which to me was always surprising. He's always, I mean, he really isn't getting into anything too serious. He gets beat up a little bit and loses some teeth. But on the other hand, you have Sancho, who is no way, man. He'll pick him up. He'll pick up Don Quixote off the ground and put him back on his mule, but he's not getting into harm's way at all. And so I think the Duke and Duchess are just playing with that. They're getting that vibe, and the Duchess in particular wants to test that and see how far he's willing to go. Probably recognizing that he's not going to get, no matter what he says he will do, he's not going to get one lash, and he probably didn't. So that was kind of my thoughts on it.
Okay, so they're just prodding Sancho where he's
Yeah.
most vulnerable. He doesn't like pain, and so make him do a painful thing to himself.
So make it a ridiculous amount of pain when he won't even do 3 of them.
Thanks. Alec, go ahead, and then Charles.
I think this is a good demonstration of how much the Duke and Duchess are looking to totally mentally dominate Sancho. Manipulation and domination is not just about, hey, I'll have somebody hit you and see you suffer, but it's finding ways to have him inflict harm on himself through multiple reasons. Loyalty to Don Quixote, an obligation, as Don Quixote obviously would like to see Dulcinea disenchanted. And the second angle on Sancho's belief or disbelief in whether or not it's really Dulcinea, because he alone knows that Dulcinea was, the fake Dulcinea was his making, although it was explained that itself was part of the enchantment. And then when neither of these seemed to have worked, there's the enticement of the governorship. Then the Duke says, if you don't do this, you're probably not suitable to be governor. So just multiple angles of mental pressure, saying you have to do this either through good reasons, loyalty, or bad reasons, carrots and sticks. You must do this, and eventually Sancho relents. So I think it's just a systematic way of mental domination. It demonstrates.
Thanks. Charles?
I'm looking at it from what I'll call the religious angle, and that is self-flagellation by the
Kevin? Hi, sorry.
Self-flagellation by what I'll call some of the religious people was a way to improve their standing with God or get to heaven. And so he's doing all this so he can get the governorship. That's his goal. That's his version of heaven. And so I think Cervantes is commenting on the religious practices that were practiced by some of the what I'll call ultra religious people, not the hermits, but necessarily, but there were people who did things like that. Some of the religious orders that would beat themselves and lash themselves for to do penance, to maybe improve their standing with others or with God.
Okay, so we've talked a bit about how Quixote seems like he's in the position, if not also Sancho, of a religiously faithful person, someone who has great faith in certain redemptive facts about the world, about the value of a way of life that don't, a faith that doesn't depend on either the active participation of other people, their corroboration of what you have faith in, or of experience bearing out your faith, offering evidence that your faith is right. Charles, I'm tempted by this reading. So you're saying Sancho is put in a position where he's similar to, say, a monk or somebody practicing a form of asceticism, where they mortify their flesh as an act of devotion. You know, along those lines, it's striking that between the two of them, Sancho seems to be the character that's, I would say, more, maybe even comically attached to his flesh. He's very worldly. He really likes eating and comfort and hates pain. So to get him to mortify his flesh seems, it's magnified by his disinclination to be that kind of a figure, somebody who deliberately undergoes punishment for the sake of spiritual edification. So, okay, I think, yeah, there's got to be something to this. You want to say more about that, Charles?
I'm responding to what you just said, and that is, Cervantes, through these episodes with Sancho and the lashing and all that, I think he's showing how it doesn't make any difference on whether or not you're going to get to where you think you're going to get. You know, your punishment of yourself doesn't make a hell of beans in getting to heaven. I think that's part of what he's saying there. And Sancho, in his simple-minded way, is saying, I like my flesh. I don't want to abuse it, because abusing it is not going to get me where I want to get.
Does it make a difference that he does become the governor to this reading? Or at least becomes a governor? Takes himself to become a governor?
Well, it makes a difference in the sense that the lashings didn't make a difference. He still got there.
I mean, you know, one way to read this, if we're following the analogy all the way through, is to say, there's something edifying about the mortification of your flesh, or committing to it. It makes you
Purer,
spiritually better in some sense, regardless of whether what the outcome is on the other side. Likewise with Quixote, we're I think as a group have been tempted by the reading that even if he's wrong about the facts of his circumstances, he displays something equivalent to real courage. He cultivates it. He displays a kind of chastity. The virtue is real in some sense, even if the rewards are not. Does anything like that apply to Sancho? He commits to the lashing, even if he doesn't, we haven't yet seen him really undergo it. He actually does get a kind of mock governorship, even if you take Cervantes to be saying how silly it is to punish yourself for the sake of an illusory heaven. Any thought about that, Charles?
well, I'll say what's in my mind right now. It's sort of like dancing for rain. I mean, it's not going to make it rain. So mortifying yourself is not going to get you to heaven. You might undergo a lot of pain, and you might, quote, feel better, close quote, for doing that in the eyes of your brothers and sisters, but it's not going to get you anywhere.
Okay, yeah, I understand that reading. I was wondering if it was just complicated by the fact that it does get Sancho somewhere, maybe both spiritually or morally. He does the kind of brave thing by committing to lashing himself, unless he's just lying. And it gets him somewhere in the sense of accomplishing the goal that he wants to accomplish. He gets made governor, as far as he knows.
Yeah.
And so it seems like Cervantes is tugging against that reading, unless you have some way to read those elements that reinforces this view that Cervantes is just making a mockery of the whole practice of spiritual mortification for the sake of getting into heaven. But it sounds like you're set on this reading.
Yeah, I don't have anything deeper than what I've said so far. Sorry.
Thanks. You've given us a lot anyway. This comparison of Sancho's lashing himself to a ascetic figure undergoing a mortification of their flesh deliberately is really rich. Thank you. April, go ahead.
I saw the reading a little bit differently. I was just going back to see the sequence of events, but Sancho's asked to lash himself after he's disclosed that he's the one that enchanted Dulcinea. So in this whole hoax, since he's the one that enchanted her, it seems appropriate in this hoax that he disenchants her by doing something. And I took it a little bit lighter touch in that he needed to take on the task, but then it was of his own free will to how he was going to do it. He could do it behind closed doors. He could do it once every 25 days. He could decide the pace, if he does it or not does it. You know, he could make that a whole theater in and of itself, the lashings, and perhaps he does in the last part of the book. But I just thought that kind of footed to the action that we saw previously, that he would be the one to be asked and to do the lashings himself.
So the idea is, on that reading, it's as if the Duke and the Duchess, in concocting this task for Sancho, have thought up a punishment to fit his crime. In some sense, he's paying for the very thing, to undo the very thing that he was responsible for, namely the enchantment of Dulcinea in Quixote's mind. Yeah, that's an interesting reading.
He's also a player in this whole let's pretend Don Quixote is who he is, right? Because Sancho enchants Dulcinea at one point, he's become a player in that sort of theater, all the hoaxes that the Duke and Duchess are concocting. Mm-hmm. So he kind of plays two roles. At some point he's gullible, and other points he's part of the instigator of different things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So he's Duke and Duchess-like in one respect, but also Quixote-like in one respect. He belongs to both worlds. Is an interesting reading. Let me skip 2B for the sake of time and ask about 2C. I think there are a few ways to take the beards, the growth of the beards as the curse of Malambruno on the duennas. The idea that I'm tempted by the thought that there's some interesting gender commentary going on here, that the beards for these duennas means, quote, unending civil death, which is to say the elimination of their rights, their legal standing, effectively. That seems interesting as the price for being a bearded woman, or being a woman with like recognizably male characteristics on your face in a way that you can't get away from. It also seems like a convenient stage prop. You know, they probably got fake beards lying around, easy to take them off while the blindfolds are on Quixote and Sancho. So what do you think about this? How should we interpret the duenna's curse, the fact that it's the growth of beards that they get cursed with in this strange prank that the Duke and the Duchess have concocted? Any thoughts about this? Karen?
Well, by civil death, I mean, it's not like women were citizens. I took that to mean that, they would be spurned, by any potential suitors, or, by the men in society, because, they would be unsightly or unseemly because of these beards.
Mhm.
And so they wouldn't be able to mix with society, not that they would be somehow banished or disenfranchised. So well, that's the main point. I had another point, I forgot it. That's my main point.
I mean, this phrase civil death, I'm pretty sure does get used in the sense of the suspension of any legal rights. That
The women don't have any legal rights, so
I'm
what
not
does
sure
that
that's
mean?
entirely true. But you're taking in the sense of like social death. The
Social death, yes.
yeah, their status in society. So, and I don't, maybe this is a translation issue, which I'm trying to look it up, but I think that's a pretty similar concept. In the eyes of the people around them, these women are outcast by virtue of having having beards, basically. That's your reading. Is that right?
Yes, that's my reading. And by the way, since they were playing a joke, I mean, it's an easier joke to play, isn't it? Since there are
Right.
plenty of men. I mean, usually men are at that time, like in Shakespeare, the only actors were all male playing women parts. Like that was that was both a common behavior and, an easy way to provide bearded women.
Thank you. April, go ahead, and then Gary.
I thought it was just another aspect of physical comedy, right? Like there's a lot of moments in this story where there's something physical that happens that's really funny or interesting. And I think having the beards on, the theatrical aspect and the props, and also the circus we talked about earlier, and having this theater of, the bearded ladies, I thought that was really right on target with what the punishment should be. And also, who cares if they're bearded duennas? Aren't they all spinster? Like, who cares if they have a beard on them in terms of what they need to do in their social life? It's, it just seemed they could still perhaps continue to do. I know one of the arguments is that they wouldn't get hired by any families, but they could still do their job as they need to do without bearded or not.
Okay, so that's interesting. On the one hand, this is like a stock image from a circus or a comedy, slap the beard on, it's silly. And on the other hand, what it means to be a duenna is to be what? It's not, that doesn't entail being presenting as feminine in the way that, say, if you're a maiden, it's part of the job description. So why should this make a difference? The fact that they say it does, maybe that's telling. That seems interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Gary, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a completely different take. I mean, to me, the two absolutes in the society we've been reading about for the last, whatever it is, 7 weeks or so, the two absolutes are believing in God and the difference between men and women. I mean, it's sort of the bedrock of Spanish society, and this bearded thing is just seemed to me to be so clever, because no one, unlike today, the whole idea of gender identity was set in stone, and so to turn these women into men would have been kind of the ultimate, violation of human rights, I guess. I mean, it's not just a matter of being able to get a job. I mean, what are they? They're not men and they're not women. So it's a very clever way of creating a curse that, at least to the 21st century eyes, just doesn't seem like much of a curse, but must have been horrific.
I mean, I imagine I'm guessing most women, I'm going to make a wild statement and say, I think most women, if they woke up with beards, would feel like it's a curse, even in our times, even if we're more friendly to the idea of gender fluidity. So on that reading, Gary, it's as if these women are what their contemporaries would take to be something like denatured. That's the curse. There's a natural category, man, woman. It's one of the most important categories into which a character in this novel can slot. And that distinction is effaced with respect to these women. And from our perspective, where we have, at least some of us, have greater tolerance for gender fluidity, this seems like it's a socially, historically particular curse. It would be less the equivalent of civil death for us than a kind of bending of a norm that is commonly bent. Am I getting the thought right?
Yeah, and take it further. I mean, the corresponding position in Moorish society would be the men who had, shall we say, an operation and became the guards of the harems. I mean, they weren't really men anymore. They weren't threatening. Duenas weren't they chaperones? Weren't they, women whose job it was to take care of, to guard younger women? And if you can't be sure about their identity anymore, that they've lost really what it is they do in life.
So this is, April's, that seems to play into April's thought that, well, the job of a duenna need not entail being feminine looking in the traditional sense of that. But Gary, it sounds like you're saying, well, yeah, it actually does. There are no male duennas. Even if that not having a beard doesn't actively contribute to the job, that's how people conceived of it. So this makes them unemployable.
It makes them unhuman. I mean, because in this society, you're either a man or you're a woman, and there's really no in between.
Okay. Any other thoughts about the growth of the beards as the particular curse that's selected for these duennas to play into this fantasy? Let me ask. Oh yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
Just one little comment that I was thinking. Up until now, every woman has been more beautiful than the woman before her. So all we've heard about is the beauty in women, beautiful, this one and that one. And then suddenly, we've got these women who are no longer beautiful. So I don't know, I was struck by that.
And that should be the worst possible curse. That seems meaningful. Maritornes is the only other woman I can think of in the novel who's described as hyperbolically ugly. But so it's not just that the curse is that these women are unfeminine and are identifiably masculine. It's that in the world of Cervantes's novel, to be a woman is to be strikingly beautiful, and having a beard is a pretty serious disruption of that sort of category defining trait. It's an interesting thought. Okay, I'm going to ask 2D. What do you make of Sancho's lies about what he saw on the horse? He says he played with the little goats, which are apparently a constellation, maybe. He looked down at the earth, and the earth was as small as a mustard seed, and he saw people on it who were as small as hazelnuts. What is going on in this scene? So on the one hand, why is Sancho embellishing? Why is he lying? Why have him get caught lying by people who know better, the Duchess and Duke and everyone present? Why this particular lie? Why, I'm going to ask 2E along with this, along with 2D, why have Quixote whisper in his ear at the end of this scene, Sancho, since you want people to believe what you saw in the sky, I want you to believe what I saw in the cave of Montesinos. I say no more. What's going on with that aspect of this episode? Is it part of the test somehow? It's another possible thought. Jesse?
I thought Don Quixote's remark was so interesting because it makes me think that they both know that what they experienced was not real. That Don Quixote knew that Sancho was lying, and he and I think he's sort of saying, I'm going to go along with your fantasy, and you go along with mine. And Sancho, it seemed to me, was kind of saying, anything goes here. We can say whatever we want. There's always going to be a way out by talking about being enchanted or this or that. So I'm going to play along with this. I'm going to do it too. It's like, anything goes in this kind of crazy circus. And I'm as justified in being part of it as anybody else. So I kind of got this feeling that they both knew that they'd been, I don't know, not played for fools, but they both knew that nothing happened.
So on that reading, Jesse, do you take Quixote, suppose there's just a few ways you can answer this question. Do you take Quixote to be attributing implicitly to Sancho the same motivations or the same kinds of motivations in concocting this story about what he saw while he was on the flying horse that Quixote has for the claims he make about the world that other people believe are false and he purports to think are true?
Well, maybe not the same motivations, but I think on some level Don Quixote knows that these things did not actually happen in the cave of, the cave of Montesino, but motivated by something different. I mean, Don Quixote is always motivated by seeking a higher virtue, a higher honor. And that's, I think Sancho is not motivated by that. Sancho is motivated more by, I'm gonna play along and I have as much right to make up a story as anybody else. Could be wrong.
So Sancho, it seems, on this reading, believes that he really was on a flying horse. And so there's no way to vet the lies that he's telling. This need not be the only way that you're taking this. And so he's gonna exploit the opportunity where he's got carte blanche to tell these people whatever he wants about what he saw, to play the same game that Quixote is playing, and for fun, just make something up. Is that right?
But I don't think that Sancho thinks he was on a flying horse.
I see, okay.
Because he peeked. He knew he wasn't on a flying horse. He looked.
Didn't he say, he said, he asked whether he could peek, and Quixote said by no means?
I didn't believe that.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I think, of course he peeked. That would
Okay.
be Sancho-like to peek.
So, I mean, that actually makes a really big difference as to how we understand Sancho's motivations, because if he peeked, then he's doing a version of what the Duke and Duchess are doing, and yet is being called on that for his lying by the Duchess. And if he didn't peek, maybe he's, I don't know, thinking that he's really getting away with telling a nice lie and having fun with it.
Yeah, more the second. Yeah,
Okay.
Let's
Or
see.
the second, okay.
I'm looking at page 764. For my part, I could say that I did not peep out from my blindfold. Well, I just didn't believe that. That's not like Sancho not to peek out from his blindfold.
Okay. Steve, go ahead. And then Marshall.
Little different perspective. I think that Sancho is trying to make up for his lack of faith earlier.
Mm.
The Duchess kind of calls him on all the, things he kind of ratted out Don Quixote on, that he really didn't believe that this was, that Don Quixote was anything other than mad. He made up the whole thing about he basically enchanted Dulcinea. And I think this is one where he's trying to show his loyalty to Don Quixote. Now, Don Quixote doesn't necessarily see it that way. And so what Don Quixote, I think, is saying is, maybe you don't believe what I saw down in the cave, but I'm asking you to believe that I saw it. And I will say the same thing for you, which is I may not believe what you just said, but I'm not going to doubt your belief in what you saw.
So there's almost a double, at least there's a pledge of loyalty and a test of loyalty then in this exchange. I mean, this is interesting. This is making me think of, so Alec earlier had said that he read the exchange between the Duchess and Sancho, in which the Duchess suggests, Sancho, you weren't lying in the way that you took yourself to be about Dulcinea's enchantment. I have it on good authority. She actually was enchanted, and Sancho goes along with it. And Steve, it sounds like you've got a reading of, at least that would fit with this reading of the moment on the wooden horse, that would fit with, help us make sense of that moment that Alec was talking about on a different model. On your reading, it's as if Sancho takes the Duchess's suggestion in that earlier discussion that Dulcinea was actually enchanted as an occasion to demonstrate or recommit to demonstrate his loyalty to Quixote or recommit to it by saying, oh, actually the story that Quixote believed was the true one all along, even if I made it up. And again, here in telling a lie about what he saw on the wooden horse, I take it you're saying he's adding evidence for the claim that what Quixote took to be going on, namely that he was actually flying on a wooden horse, is actually what was going on. It couldn't have been otherwise if Sancho had seen the goats, played with the goats, and seen the earth is very small. And then at the end of the scene, when Quixote asks Sancho to play along or to believe in his story about the cave of Montesinos, Sancho, having made up a story that reinforces Quixote's conception of events, and thereby demonstrates loyalty to Quixote. Quixote is asking him to take another step in that direction and reinforce another false story that Quixote takes to be the true one, namely the story about the cave of Montesinos. Is that right?
Again, the story is only false from our perspective or from people looking out. What he's asking Sancho to do is to have the same level of faith in what he, the faith is in Don Quixote. I mean, what Don Quixote is asking, he's doubling down on the, what I saw. I know you're skeptical, but I believe it. And I think what he's saying is, what I'm simply asking for is, I'm not going to contradict what you just said, even though I'm skeptical, because I have faith in you. Okay, or I'm willing to have faith in you that what you said wasn't just a pile of lies, even though I can't prove that you really saw it either. So I think a little bit about the nature of faith, and you can have faith to the idea and you can have faith to the individual.
But was I right in thinking that you thought that Sancho was demonstrating faith in Quixote's story or commitment to it by telling his lie about what he saw on the wooden horse in the first place?
Yes.
Okay, so there are two moments in this scene then when he demonstrates, or is on the one hand demonstrates, and on the other hand is asked to further commit to loyalty to Quixote. He tells the lie that reinforces Quixote's story, and then Quixote asks him, well, now believe what I said about the cave of Montesinos, which is a request to commit to faith in Quixote again. Okay, thank you. Marjorie, go ahead. Marjorie, you're muted.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. And the other thing that struck me, though, was Sancho is getting bolder and bolder, and he seems to be more, he's one of the group now. He wants to be a full player here. And so he's kind of adding his own story and flair to this. I just see him as developing more and more and getting bolder and bolder in this whole story.
So do you see him as Duke and Duchess like in that respect, Marjorie? This is
In some way, he's sort of stepped over on the side of the Duke and Duchess.
Yeah.
When he does this. He's kind of identifying with them and he's going to be part of it. And he's really enjoying himself.
Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to correct what I said before. I gave the wrong quote, and the person who I was looking at before was Don Quixote speaking, but Sancho speaks on page 763 and says in that first paragraph that he's quoted, he says, I'm a bit on the curious side, keen to know what I'm not supposed to know, so on the sly, and so no one would see me, I pulled the blindfold aside and looked down towards the earth, and he goes on with his story. So, you know, at this point, he realizes that, you know, they were going nowhere. He was down there on the earth, and he makes up this story. And I think, like Marjorie said, and you know, and he's, and like I said before, he is kind of thinking, well, okay, I'll tell a story too. I can join this this charade.
So I read that line differently, Jesse, but I don't see
Oh, really?
a definitive evidence for why we should go with my reading or your reading. So one way to read this is to say, Sancho requests earlier in this chapter that he asks whether it's okay for him to take off his blindfold, and Quixote says, no, don't do it under no circumstances. On my reading, he didn't do it, but then afterward he told the group he did take off his blindfold and then lies to them about what he saw. On your reading, he did take off the blindfold, saw that this was all a hoax, and then afterward, like self-consciously played along in elaborating on, I mean, filling in the details of what he might have seen had he been flying through the air, knowing all the while that nobody around him believes the story that he's telling. I can't think of like good evidence for deciding on one of those readings rather than the other, but it seems like they're both possible, at least given what the passage that you read. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, it's just that I don't know that Sancho would necessarily listen to Don Quixote about something like that. You know, he was scared. He was like, oh my God, you know, this is going to be horrible. And yeah, it didn't even occur to me that he wouldn't have looked. It just is in his character to look, I felt. And
Awesome.
concocting this story.
Gary?
You know, what's so interesting to me is that we have no idea. I mean, here we have two totally different points of view about the same fairly small event. And that says to me something about what's going on with these characters. We touched on this earlier about the sort of what's the difference between the first half of the book and the second half of the book. And one of the differences to me is that there are only two characters, I think, that we really know or think we know. And one is Don Quixote and one is Sancho Panza. I mean, the Duke and the Duchess, for example, they're almost cardboard characters. I mean, they're playing, you know, their noble roles, but we really know nothing about them. And I think that's true of most of the characters, maybe all of the characters we've come across in the second half. And now all of a sudden, with Sancho, we're starting to wonder about who he is. I mean, I don't know about anybody else, but I have no doubts about Don Quixote. If Don Quixote says something crazy, it's because he believes it. It's because he's crazy. And when he has his moments of sanity, he's an absolutely brilliant guy. And that's not crazy either, that people can be exactly like that. I feel like I know him. Sancho, all of a sudden, I don't think I know anymore. I feel like Cervantes is playing with us. I mean, I think this whole novel is him playing with us, but this whole episode, I couldn't decide. Is Sancho, is he becoming crazy like Don Quixote? Is he lying to support Don Quixote, something that he really hasn't done before? I don't think. I mean, I have no idea, and that totally changes my view of these two guys. I mean, I thought I knew them both, and to me, that's a big difference. That's something that is part of how at every stage, I feel like Cervantes is experimenting with us, what we're talking about right now.
Thanks, Gary. Your video got a little strange there, but I think we actually heard everything you said. It just came out very slowly at one point. So it sounds like the way you're reading this, either of those reading is Sancho genuinely taken in, or going insane in the way that Quixote is, or is Sancho lying? Either of those is compatible with your larger thought, which is that Sancho's changing relative to the guy we thought we knew in part one. We're getting a transformed Sancho in part two. I mean, I take it this harkens back to the note at the beginning of, I believe it was chapter 5, in which I think Cide Hamete Benengeli says, I take this chapter to be apocryphal, or maybe it's the translator, because in it, Sancho says things that are not in keeping with his character. Maybe that's just generally more true about part 2, that there's a transformation of Sancho. Do you see that more generally, or just in episodes, this episode or episodes like it?
This is the first time I really thought about it, because quite frankly, I've gotten kind of tired of these endless little stories within stories, and so what makes it more interesting for me anyway is thinking about why Cervantes is doing it. And so when I find something now that I don't understand and can't make any sense of, my very first thought is, okay, this guy's playing a mind game with us, and why is he doing it? And the other thing I'd say about Sancho is, I mean, he's always been kind of, I don't know how you, maybe here's another reality show term, fan favorite. Sancho's kind of been a fan favorite. He's been sort of our jester, right? We kind of like him. At least I do. I have. He's crude, but he's smart in a crude way. He's funny. He's true to himself. And all of a sudden, he isn't anymore. At least he doesn't seem like he is in some ways. So there's got to be a reason, and I don't know what it is, but something's going on.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come up with something at some point. Thanks. Let me ask 2F in the way that I asked it here. I mean, we were kind of already in this territory when we were talking generally about what the Duke and Duchess are up to, how we should understand these episodes. But look, there's a series of theatrical tricks or pranks or deceptions through parts 1 and 2. I've listed them all out in 2F, so I'm not going to cite every single one. Are there particular episodes in this list that, if you think about them alongside what the Duke and the Duchess are up to, sparks fly for you of a certain kind? Do you see points of similarity or difference that are especially telling? Do they belong to this series in a meaningful way? Are they importantly different in a way that sets them off as, for instance, sadistic in a way that nobody quite has been so far? That's one reading we've heard a few times. What do you think? How should we think about them as entries in this long series of theatrical tricks or deceptions? Okay, maybe we've just chewed the one already. Steve, you have a thought?
This is almost the reverse of your question, so I won't go off on too far a tangent. But actually, this series of tricks and pranks and tests, as I called them earlier, actually gives me more perspective on how to regard things like the tale of inappropriate curiosity was a different kind of test. Quixote is not directly involved in it, but Cervantes is playing around with this notion again of things that can look horribly cruel at one angle, and that one sure does. I mean, that one's like, it's hard to read any other way. It's a kind of an example of an utterly misguided test from an utterly hard to rationalize on any level. We kind of ascended into another level of testing with these pranks, which again, we can read much more ambivalently. We can read them really harshly. We can read them, as things that are humiliating if you're in on the joke. I mean, again, we haven't gotten to the end of this whole sequence. So part of it is, the Duke and Duchess may regard these things as humiliating. I'm not sure I buy into that strong, but so far, that's not the way that either Don Quixote or Sancho were seeing it. They're seeing them as obstacles. Sancho is the obstacle to get to my governorship of the island, which has its own kind of tests built into it, when he gets to become the judge of what's going on. Don Quixote, is being treated like a knight, and he's getting, knight appropriate tests, which he's getting. So I think it's giving me more of a lens to see some of the stuff that frankly looked like odds and ends earlier in the book. And it looked like Cervantes is to some degree cleaning up after himself, perhaps, in the way, or kind of letting us understand a little bit more of what its thinking was in terms of what some of those odd stories actually had to do with anything.
Right. So this criticism this was John's reading of the passage that I quoted in question 4 on page 776, where Cervantes says, look, there were all these criticisms about part 1, that there were episodes unrelated to Quixote. Even though they were beautifully told and Quixote was involved in all of them, I've decided in part 2 just to focus on a story that involves Quixote and Sancho in every episode. And Steve, your thought is maybe the tale of inappropriate curiosity, either Cervantes is cleaning up after himself, which is to say he's giving a justification retrospectively for how the tale of inappropriate curiosity is actually useful for thinking about Quixote. They both involve tests of fidelity and virtue, concocted tests in which somebody's trying to know something about someone else by placing them in a kind of fake situation that they take to be real. Or it could be that that's what Cervantes was doing when he wrote the tale of inappropriate curiosity, giving us a situation that's analogous to the condition of Quixote, which is analogous to something in our ordinary lives that we all is part of the human condition. Both interesting thoughts. April, go ahead, and then Cindy.
I was just looking at the list of all the theatrical tricks that you listed here, and so many of them include an obstruction of sight, right? Like they can't see, someone is dropped into a cave, someone's in a wardrobe, somebody is behind a wall. There's even people in windows, you can't see them clearly. And I just thought that's definitely an element of the theatrical tricks throughout the novel. And I find that particularly interesting because this reads like a play to me, and I don't read a lot of plays, I watch a lot of plays. And so that whole, you can't see what's going on, I can't see what's going on as a reader. I'm completely relying on what's told to me about each of the characters and what's told to me about the whole situation. So I think there's some interesting play there that maybe the author wanted to mark that you can't see what's going on and neither can these characters.
That's great. So let me try to say this back to you. So, maybe in these particular theatrical tricks, but maybe in theater in general, part of the illusion depends on our vision being obstructed or tailored in a certain way. You know, the lights go down, so you have to focus on just what's on the stage, even when there's no elaborate theatrical trick. But a lot of, you know, puppet shows or scenery or stunts on a stage or stage violence or things of that kind rely on a messing with our vision in order for us to believe that what's happening, or even with the suspension of belief, have what's happening on the stage look as if it's really happening when it's not. Likewise, readers of a novel are always in the position of not being able to, how should I put this? We're relying on the author to tell us what's relevant and exclude what's not, or something like that, obstruct our vision in the sense of concocting a fantasy that we can't see around. We can't check it by verifying it in the way that we might verify most stories. Our vision is narrowed or obstructed in that sense. And I take it you're saying that especially comes through with a novel that's about theater, where you're watching theatrical scenes play out and you can't see them because it's a novel and not a stage play. So maybe we're in the position of the deluded people in these various theatrical tricks. They're like readers in some sense. Am I getting the thought right?
Yes, that's part of it. And also, you know, we are reading the words. So I'm taking this in through my eyes, right? I'm reading this stuff. However, I have to use my own thoughts and imagination of what this looks like. And so I do think there's a play on that as well, and that we're reading this story and it's my imagination. So the author's giving me all the things I need to know, including this person can't see what's going on, or this person is behind a door. So I think it positions us like the audience of a play.
Huh. I mean, now this is making me think, well, who's the equivalent of the audience in the Duke and the Duchess in their fantasy? You might think it's the Duke and the Duchess, but on this reading, the people who get their vision occluded or narrowed or are blinded in some respect are Quixote and Sancho, primarily. They're observers of scenes and also participants in those scenes. And they're also, and they're observed by the people who've set up the circus, as Alec had it. So now I'm wondering who even the equivalent of the reader or the audience is in these various scenes involving theatrical tricks.
Well, I think with the wooden horse, I really felt that there was a performance expected, and also of the cave, of Don Quixote going down into the cave and coming back up, and everyone saying, "What'd you see?" And so there's this moment where they're on the stage and they have to tell you what they saw. And I think there's an expectation of performance. So we're kind of flipping, you know, in the case of the wooden horse, the Duke and the Duchess, they create, maybe they're the director, they create this scene and then they throw their characters in it and they're not sure what's going to come out of it. Like, well, these characters, what kind of sizzle are they going to have when they're given this, and what kind of imagination will they take it to?
That's it. So, I mean, okay, so what's the difference between, it's like the difference between making Quixote a guy who has to improv without any scenery or props, and a guy for whom the scene has been largely constructed for him, and he's just a much narrower remit as to what he needs to improv about. You know, the Duke and Duchess have brought the whole story, and he just needs to fill in his tiny part rather than make up the entire scene of what's going on in the cave of Montesinos, and, you know, who the giants are and who the princesses are and so forth. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, Cindy, go ahead.
So what struck me about your list is not the similarities of the different theatrical tricks. It's the number of people in this book who are willing to take part in them, to act in them. That's really stunning if you look at this list, how everybody was willing to play a role or in each one of these. You know, it reminds me of Mary Zimmerman, the director, has described actors as when we were kids, our parents would tell us to come in from playing after dinner when the street lights went on, and actors haven't come in yet. And that my actor friends would all get this and they'd all be in the game. They'd all be playing. My lawyer friends would not understand this at all. So what hits me about this is how many people we've seen in this and how his so many, almost every one of his characters at some point, even like the barber and the priest, who are kind of like the, you know, the dourest characters, they played a part too. Like everyone was an actor in there. I don't know where the audience is. Maybe we're the audience, or maybe it doesn't matter. But what I think is striking, and maybe one of the things that gives this, you know, that makes this book so popular and lasts so long, is the number of characters who are willing to keep playing and to play.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation. You know, at various points we see, for instance, I'm thinking of like the entire countrysides or forests that are populated with shepherds who are in love with the same woman. It's as if the landscape of Don Quixote is populated by willing actors. They're people who are just really into stepping into a performance or concocting one. It's an interesting thought. Let me ask about 2G. So this is very slightly modulating the question we were already talking about. Rather than think about the Dukes and the Duchesses theatrical pranks alongside the other theatrical deceptions or pranks that we've seen in the past, can you get any mileage out of thinking about them in relation to the either theoretical discussions of theater or the other instances in which literal theatrical performance has entered into the novel, as with the morality play at the wedding, as with the puppet show, the discussion of theater between the priest, the canon, and Don Quixote? Is there anything there that arises for you if you think about these things alongside one another? Okay, sounds like maybe not, although I don't want to cut off the thinking process if something's brewing. Because I'm fairly sure that people are going to have thoughts about 2H. But if you want to answer 2G, well, after I ask 2H, go ahead. But okay, the churchman at the very end of our reading for last time, at the end of chapter 32, and then again, or excuse me, at chapter 31, and then again in chapter 32, he says to the Duke a version of something that I think some of you might be tempted to say to the Duke and the Duchess, although maybe it's not exactly right on. I mean, so as I understand it, the churchman says effectively, Quixote, you're crazy, go home, what are you doing? This is nothing for a grown man to be doing, go tend to your family and so forth. And the Duke, he condemns the Duke for nurturing Quixote's fantasies, says if sane men encourage the fantasies of the insane, well, we're all lost. And likewise for, as he puts it on 702, sanctioning Quixote's madness. Is this like the right moral stance we should take towards the Duke and the Duchess? I mean, we're back to this question about the moral status of the Duke and the Duchess. The churchman is one advocate of one kind of stance we could take on what they're up to. Is he getting it right? If not, what's wrong with it? What do you think? Any thoughts about that? Steve?
It feels wrong. You know, it's just one of those things where you look at the words, you say, yep. You know, he's not saying anything that in a sense isn't true, but it feels wrong and judgmental and like he's missing the point in some way. That he's one more, I mean, again, this is that the dilemma is Don Quixote is on this quest, and the Duke and Duchess, for whatever reasons, are furthering that quest and providing challenges and opportunities They've even given him an opportunity to really feel like a knight. And we can say, but he's crazy, okay? The church, and they don't, and maybe they're playing with him just because they want to play with him. So no one's totally good or totally bad here. The churchman is totally oblivious to what's motivating Don Quixote, or that there could be any good coming out of it. And so he's just saying you're all a bunch of damn crazy people and sinners for even humoring this guy on. And he's missing the point also. So the words may be at one level correct, but they miss the point.
So even if it's wrong on this reading for the Duke and the Duchess to do what they do to Quixote and also to Sancho, the churchman is motivated to condemn what they're doing, in part because he has just a kind of tin ear for what we can hear in Quixote's story. Namely, there is something genuinely redemptive and edifying about what Quixote is up to. He, in pretending like he has certain virtues, he practices those virtues in some respect. And the churchman just has no idea about that. He's not alive to the power of faith, ironically, or of commitment or something like that. Is that right, Steve? Karin, go ahead.
Well, my reaction originally when I read it was to think that it is a reflection of the dogma of the Catholic Church at the time. I mean, the church basically told people what was right to believe and what was wrong to believe. And, you know, they repeatedly dismissed the values and the ideas behind knight errants. And so it just felt like, you know, the churchman was saying that they were wrong to encourage this because it in his mind encourages values or beliefs that aren't compatible with the church dogma.
Mm-hmm. So earlier the canon said to Quixote that one thing that's wrong with these books is that they works of chivalry is that they I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it's something like generate new sects and new ways of life. And Karin, I take it you're saying the churchman has a similar reading of not just books of chivalry, but people who live as knights errant. Namely, they're doing something that's condemnable on religious doctrinal grounds. Is that right?
Yes, I mean,
Yeah.
yes, that was my perception.
Okay, thank you. Cindy, go ahead.
So I guess this goes with what I was just saying about all these other people who are willing to play along and enjoy the play. If you were going to cast this guy, or I don't know how you saw him in your head when you read it, but he's like a nasty old buzzkill guy, right? Yeah, I mean, it's not like he's saying anything like we've got to get this guy some help or he's kind or anything else. He's just like, you should be doing, he thinks Don Quixote needs to go back and take care of his family, and I mean, he's just like an unappealing character. And then Don Quixote answers him pretty well when, you know, 700 it's one of his better answers. So I guess I think, yeah, you're asking of twice condemns for incur. So is he a right to do so? Well, I guess so. Sure, there's always somebody around like that, right? Especially in a story like that. But you know, he is going to be cast. The actor who plays him is just not going to look like he's going to be the guy you want to hang around with. He's not the fun guy, and he's not really helping him. I mean, he's not doing something helpful. He's just doing something judgmental. And so I guess I think that's the way Cervantes wrote him, and he's contrasts everybody else who, even when they know Quixote is you know, in another world, they're willing to play in that world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I take it, Cindy, that you've described him well. The churchman comes off as a pompous, condescending jerk. but that is what I take to be challenging about him. He's the only person who says to the Duke and Duchess, or I guess just to the Duke, but the Duchess seems to be implicated in this. What you're doing is wrong. How, like, don't nurture this guy's delusions. It's the kind of thing we could imagine the people who care about Quixote back in his village, the priest and the barber, to say to the Duke and the Duchess, even if they would say it, they wouldn't be such jerks about it. So it's striking that Cervantes puts that thought in the
I
mouth
don't
of
think he's saying it because he cares about Don Quixote. He's saying it because it violates his principles, okay?
Right.
And I mean, he calls him Don Idiot, Don Simpleton. I mean, he's not doing it because he's saying, you know, this is real. This man has a problem, and you could hurt him doing this. That's not the argument he's making.
Right.
He's making a totally judgmental argument. So I don't see him as like the voice of reason. And my problem with all this is, what do you do with a Don Quixote except lock him away?
Mhm.
And when you lock Don Quixote away, oh, I don't want to be the person who has to do that. So that's to me the dilemma here. And I guess why I'm more forgiving of what these other people do.
Thanks. Gary, go ahead.
Well, I think this is another Cervantes mind game. I think it was Mad Magazine. I may be wrong. It may have been another one of those magazines, but sometimes they'd have this little character drawn outside of the frame of the cartoon. And the little character would be pointing into the cartoon and saying something like, "This is really stupid." And that's how I read The Churchman. You know, you've got the Duke and the Duchess, and they're kind of another one of those. Well, they're the playwrights, right? They're writing a story. They're like Cervantes, and they're like the narrator, and they're like the interpreter, and they're like, you know, these, whoever's telling the story, they're telling the story. And here we've got that little character who's coming up and saying, "This is a stupid story. This is completely wrong. You shouldn't be doing it." It's almost like popping a balloon. It's some kind of, and again, I'm still trying to figure this out, but it seems to me it's this Arthurial little editorial footnote that he's sticking in.
So
I don't know if it's to.
Sorry, go ahead, Gary.
I was just going to say, I don't know if it's to make the reader, you know, snap back to reality and realize, you know, this is the game that's being played, and it's a story. I don't know yet, but that's the only thing that made any sense to me.
So on that reading, do you take Cervantes to be accusing himself of sanctioning the madness of Don Quixote or encouraging it? Is he guilty on some, maybe even a crazy way, if we don't really credit the Churchman? Is he toying with the idea of himself being guilty of sanctioning Quixote's madness or encouraging it?
I think he's experimenting. I think he's creating a whole system of telling a story, or telling stories, this novel. And he's doing all kinds of different things to us. You know, the thing I was talking about with Sancho before, and the way he uses the Duke and Duchess as yet another, you know, storyteller or writer or playwright. And this to me is just, this is not him even taking an editorial opinion. It's him using a device to, I don't know, to say something to the reader about, you know, this has been a really fun story, but I can't do any better than that.
Okay, no, thank you. That's very good. You needn't do better. It's very good already. Steve, go ahead.
Little extra twist. As I'm thinking about it, the Churchman is like a bad critic. Okay, he's criticizing Quixote's novel, and Quixote is making him look like a jerk. I think he's lampooning critics. He's kind of, again, this is one where I think Gary's exactly right. This is, you know, the literality, the theatricality, the show is what the Duke and Duchess were all about. kind of stand-ins again for Cervantes, and he's had this grumpy critic. Okay, that, you know, Cynthia said with a buzzkill saying this is really a crappy story, and the answer is he gets blown off, and that's the last we see of him. At least that's the last we see of him for a while.
Yeah. So, Steve, I mean, let me ask you about that. So, does that mean we're implicated in the portrayal of this jerk as like a buzzkill when we criticize the Duke and Duchess in a similar way? When we condemn them or get, you know, feel irritated by their callous disregard for the humanity of Sancho and Quixote?
We're verging on that, yeah.
That's interesting. So on that reading, Cervantes is saying, if you think this is inhumane, or if you're inclined to, you know, get your dudgeon up to feel outraged about what the Duke and Duchess do, you're like the churchman.
You're just a little bit like, there's a grumpy character. I just wandered onto the stage and batted him off.
It's a good trick on Cervantes' part. All right, well, let me, we have 15 minutes. Let me piece through these other questions and see what we can see. I'm gonna skip 3. I guess I'll come back to it if we have time.
Hey, Noah, before we leave this, could I just one other thing in defense of the Duke and Duchess, not that, you know, made up characters need to be defended, but it seems to me that they were almost required to be the way they are. I mean, if you're gonna create, if you're gonna tell the story in a different way, which is what they do, they have to have the wherewithal to do it, right? So this story, at least this part of the story, couldn't be told by, you know, the village priest or the rich landowner. It had to be someone with great power and a lot of money to put on these extravagant tales. And if you're going to tell the story this way, I think the characters had to be the way they are. Now, whether that makes them sadists or, you know, innocent instruments, I don't know. But I think it was a really clever device of Cervantes that was almost unavoidable.
So they had to be have no qualms about putting Quixote and Sancho through this series of pranks. They had to have really grand means of doing so. They had to be rich and powerful, basically. And they had to be fans so that they enjoyed the antics. Is that right, Gary?
Yeah, why else would they do it?
I mean,
and you don't want to paint them as sadists. I mean, you can't. You're going to hate the whole thing if they start out as being cruel, evil landlords. But they're nobles, right? And they use people, and they have the money and the means and the power. So it just seemed to me that they sort of had to be the way they are.
I guess on the question of why else would they do it, we get the priest and the barber and Dorothea doing something similar, albeit for totally different motives. And likewise, Sanson Carrasco tries to do something similar, less grand, but for totally different motives. Both of them are trying to steer Quixote back home rather than push him further into the quest. I have to say, I keep thinking about Genesis, and I don't want to bring it up because I don't like bringing up outside texts that people haven't read. Has everybody been through the first year of the basic program? So maybe I'm on solid ground in doing this. You know, the Joseph story, you might ask, like, why does Joseph put his brothers through this dreamlike experience where they can't help but commit a series of crimes? He kind of pushes them further down a version of the facing the crime they've already committed, where they're responsible for landing Benjamin into trouble and bringing him back to Egypt and putting him in jail. And, you know, so he does something really similar to his brothers that as what the Duke and the Duchess do to Quixote and Sancho, although that story is kind of tragic moral, whereas this is comedic, more clown-like, circus-like. And when you're asked, like, why else would they do this? I was thinking, well, Joseph had a reason for putting his brothers through all of that, for maintaining this fiction. And his reason is, my guess is as good as yours. I guess there are a short list of possible candidates for reasons: to exercise them morally, to observe them in a disinterested manner in a situation that was analogous to his own, to make them feel their own guilt. I don't know what, it's complicated, but he's in a similar kind of fan fiction role, albeit deadly serious. So I don't know. It seems to me like it could be really complicated. Why else would they put Quixote and Sancho through a series of concocted theatrical pranks? I could imagine other reasons. That's the only reason I bring up that parallel. You have a response?
Well, maybe it's a distinction without a difference, but it's one thing to be a character who has motives. It's another thing to be a character who is also the author. And the Duke and Duchess are both characters and authors. I mean, they create these scripts, these elaborate, expensive extravaganzas, these cinematic kind of arrangements that nobody else does. I mean, they're not just characters, I don't think. So to me, that's why I just don't think there's another reason that they would create this. I mean, I can understand why Cervantes did it.
Mhm.
I don't have any other way that they would do it.
Thanks. Yeah, that's all very interesting. Well, look, question 5 is still in the territory of the Duke and the Duchess's tricks, so we're kind of on the same subject. So I'm going to go to that, and if we have time, go to 3 and 4. It seems it's impossible to tell exactly how much control the Duke and the Duchess have over what happens to Sancho when he's serving as a governor, but it seems like at least some control is the answer. I don't even notice where to start because I find this all very interesting. But does anyone just want to pick anything from 5B to 5G, any of the episodes that I've asked about? If there's one that you find particularly interesting, rather than going through them one by one, we don't really have time. If there's one that you find especially meaningful for thinking about Sancho, for thinking about what the Duke and the Duchess are up to and trying to put him through a series of kind of fantasy exercises, then take your pick. Which of these do you find interesting or meaningful? Does anyone have an interpretation to just share with the rest of us? Steve, and then Cindy.
Well, the one that probably was most striking to me is where Sancho shows a level of insight that you just go, wow, which is the whole thing with the 10 escudos and the knife and making him give it back and seeing through that whole charade. In some ways, it's like Sancho's finest moment as a governor, where he comes, he has a level of insight and wisdom born of simply his practical experience, and he applies it in a way that you just go, that's right. That's the analysis. That's like the locked room mystery where you say, the body was there and there are no windows and there's no doors and you were watching it the whole time, and yet there actually was an answer.
Right.
And he digs down and finds that. I mean, I think this is one where, again, Cervantes is rounding out Sancho's character. I mean, I don't know who said it, but there's a difference almost in the relative importance in the story in part 2 so far. I mean, Sancho is becoming a much more dominant character. And whereas he was kind of the cartoon character sidekick in book 1, in some ways he becomes as fully rounded a character as Don Quixote in part 2. And this is showing another part to him, which we certainly never would have suspected.
As reals make me worried you've got what Quixote has, Steve, but stay with us. I'm sure it's not that bad. So yeah, I think it was Gary and had said that earlier, that there's a different Sancho in part 2. He's more complicated. He's changing relative to the Sancho we thought we knew. That's definitely at work. I really like the thought that Sancho is like a detective when he's playing the judge role. There's kind of a riddle feeling to at least the second and third cases that he hears, and he solves the riddle correctly, even though none of us would have been able to do it. Cindy, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree, and I actually like the one with the mosquitoes too, because I didn't see it coming. I was like, wow, that very smart. But what it is, and in that sense, it's almost like the Solomon one of the split the baby in half. It's an understanding of human nature. He observes these people very closely, and from the physical to understanding greed, understanding human motivation, and that's how he solves it. So I thought he should be a judge. I'd love to try a case in front of this guy. He's really good.
Cindy, so on that reading, the idea that this demonstrates deep insight into human nature on Sancho's behalf, does that fit with our conception of Sancho? I mean, is this just like a radical change relative to the Sancho we knew? Does it somehow make sense of the Sancho we already knew, or at least is it consistent with it in some way? What do you think?
Well, it's in some way, other than his following Don Quixote, doesn't make much sense, but he is more a man of the soil. All of these people are kind of also, I think, his peer group, and so you get a sense of him having way more exposure to a variety of people. Do you know what I mean? Someone who would steal the 10 mosquitoes and put them in and then figure out a way to say, I gave them back, and be telling the truth.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, or a way to test who's really physically the strongest in this situation.
Right.
I'm trying to figure out how to do that in a courtroom, okay? But and then he can see, well, wait a minute, the physicality, he can do that evaluation. I think it's not that far to think he could do that because of the class he comes from, because of the kind of work he does, because of the sense you have that he probably is in the world a little more than a Don Quixote who might not, or a noble or someone like that who might not be able to do that. So I guess in that way, but it certainly is not necessarily what we would have expected from the day we met him. Okay, so yeah, there's some change, but it's not totally off the wall to think that he has an understanding of human nature in these particular situations based on his experience.
Right. So the thought, I think I'm hearing two thoughts in there. One is that there's something about Sancho's being a peasant that makes him better at understanding what goes on out there in the rough and tumble world where people come into conflict and act however they do. And on the other hand, it sounded like you were suggesting, well, Sancho's kind of a trickster. He can lie. He can tell a good lie when his back's up against the wall, or sometimes even when it's not. And so he's capable of reverse engineering this other trick or lie about the 10 escudos and the staff because he is good at making them. So
he might have done it. He could have done it. Yeah, he's capable of doing it.
An interesting thought. Karen, go ahead.
Well, his character is also kind of an everyman. He spouts all these proverbs all the time. And they're so down to earth. I mean, they're so based on common everyday experience. And but he spouted them before. When he first got with Don Quixote, he was spouting them off based on no experience. He had no experience. He'd always lived in this tiny place and had this tiny life. And now he's had these adventures. He's gaining experience and probably a little perspective. And because he has been a shrewd observer in the book, I think he's putting some of the pieces together on human behavior. I mean, I think the fact that he's changing is a reflection of him growing through some of these experiences.
That's interesting. So that's actually really different from Cindy's reading. Cindy was saying it's because Sancho's a peasant that makes a good judge in these instances. Karin, it sounds like you're saying when Sancho was living as a peasant, he was pretty ignorant of the larger world and the people in it. And there's something about his being out adventuring with Quixote that's prepared him for this, to pass this test as governor, namely to pass sound judgments, solve these riddles that we see him solving.
Well, not exactly what I meant, because I mean, I still think like the common sense comes from being a peasant, but I do also think he's kind of evolving as he has experiences and as he sees how people behave in these various experiences. He's becoming a little more suspicious, for example, about what the trick is. He's becoming, he's becoming a little wiser about human nature, because he's seeing more than he saw in his tiny little village.
Earlier, he said, being with Don Quixote is the manure that's been spread over the barren soil of his poor wits. Until
Yes.
this time that he's been with him, serving him. I mean,
And
Karin,
he
you're
talked about it making the soil more fertile, which it
Right,
seems to be.
that's on page 558. So you're saying maybe it's about exposure to other people and what he sees on the road that makes him a bit wiser than he would have been. He in that passage says it's being with Quixote, although maybe he's flattering Quixote. But in any case,
Yeah.
you've got this larger reading according to which what happens to Sancho on the road prepares him for this moment, which is it's a really interesting thought. All right, well, it's 9:16 my time, so we should call it a night. I will see you all in a week to talk about the next tranche of chapters. Look forward to it. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Enjoy